The advertisement was 14 words long. Cook wanted. Ranch work. Fair wages. No questions asked. Mercer Ranch. Dry Hollow. Silas had written it himself, standing at the small desk in the corner of his study, scratching it out with a pencil stub he'd been meaning to replace for 3 weeks. He wasn't a man who spent much time on words. He spent time on cattle counts and fence lines and the price of winter hay. Words, in his experience, had a way of promising more than they delivered. He folded the paper, rode into town on a Tuesday morning before most people were stirring, and tacked it to the board outside Garrett's general store without making eye contact with a soul. Then he turned his horse around and went home. That had been 11 days ago. The 2 women who had come out since then hadn't lasted a full afternoon. The first one, Mrs. Calloway's niece from up near Red Rock, had taken one look at the size of the kitchen and announced that she hadn't signed on to cook for an army. The second one had been pleasant enough, but spent more time asking questions about the silver candlesticks in the dining room than she did looking at the stove. Silas had paid her for her time and watched her buggy disappear down the road without much feeling either way. He was beginning to think maybe he'd just eat jerky and tinned beans through the winter and be done with it. It was a Thursday, gray sky, cold wind coming off the ridge, when he heard the gate creak. He was out behind the barn, working a split in the fence post with a hammer and wedge, not because it needed doing urgently, but because his hands needed something to do. He heard the creak, looked up, and saw a woman coming down the long drive on foot. No buggy, no horse, just her, on foot, carrying a worn leather satchel in one hand and holding her hat against the wind with the other. She was tall for a woman, though she walked like someone who'd learned to make herself smaller. Her coat was clean but thin. Wrong coat for the weather, he noted automatically, the way a man notes things that don't line up. Her boots were good leather, but the heels were worn down to almost nothing. She walked steadily, not in a hurry, but not dawdling either, like someone who had decided on a direction and wasn't in the habit of second-guessing herself once she was moving. Silas set down his hammer and watched her come. She stopped about 10 feet from him. She was maybe mid-30s, dark eyes, the kind of face that had probably been pretty in a softer life, but had been sharpened by something harder. There was a bruised yellow shadow under her left eye that was fading, but not faded. She didn't try to hide it, and she didn't draw attention to it either. She just looked at him steadily, the way a person does when they've run out of the luxury of being embarrassed. "You Silas Mercer?" she asked. "I am," he said. "I'm here about the cook position." She reached into her coat and produced a folded piece of paper. His advertisement, cut clean from the board. Evelyn Reed. "I can cook, I can clean, I can keep books if you need it, and I don't steal." A pause. "Those are things I thought were worth saying up front." He looked at her for a moment. "You walk from town?" "Stage dropped me at the crossroads. That's about 3 miles, I think. In those boots." She glanced down at her feet, then back up at him. "They got me here." He picked up his hammer, turned it over in his hand once, and said, "Kitchen's inside. I'll show you what needs doing." That was how it started. Not with a handshake, not with pleasantries. Just a man with a hammer pointing toward a door and a woman with worn-down heels walking through it. The Mercer Ranch kitchen was a large room that smelled of nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of problem. Kitchens were supposed to smell like something. This one smelled like an empty building, dust and cold stone and the faint ghost of wood smoke from a fire that hadn't been properly tended in some time. Evelyn set her satchel on the floor by the door and walked the room slowly, not saying anything. She opened the cold larder. She checked the state of the wood box. She lifted the lid on a pot that had been left on the back of the stove and looked inside with the expression of a woman who had seen worse and not been surprised by it. "How long since you had regular cooking done here?" she asked. 8 months, roughly," Silas said. He was leaning in the doorway. He hadn't offered her a chair, he realized. Old habit. His father used to say you didn't offer a chair until you'd decided whether you wanted someone to stay. "What happened 8 months ago?" "My housekeeper moved to be with her daughter in Tucson." Evelyn nodded. "What do you normally eat?" "Whatever's simple." "Simple meaning what?" "Bread if I get to town, beans, eggs when the hens are cooperative." She looked at the stove again. It was a good stove, a big iron range that would have been expensive when it was new, and it was clear somebody had taken care of it for a long time before recently neglecting it. She ran her hand along the top of it, looked at the residue on her palm, and seemed to make a decision. "I'll need the larder stocked," she said. "I can make a list, and someone will need to carry wood in. That box is half empty, and it's going to be cold tonight." "I can carry wood," Silas said. She looked at him with a slight shift in her expression. like she'd expected an argument and wasn't sure what to do with the absence of one. All right then. The terms, he said. $14 a month. You take Sunday afternoons for yourself. There's a room off the back of the house. It's small, but it's warm. You board here or you don't, that's up to you. She was quiet for a moment. What happened to the two women who came before me? He hadn't expected that. One didn't like the kitchen, one liked the silver too much. And what's it going to be with me? I don't know yet, he said honestly. Do you want the job? I want the $14, she said. The job comes with it. He almost smiled. Almost. Fair enough, he said. I'll get the wood. She made a pot of bean soup that first evening, nothing elaborate, she'd worked with what was there, and set it on the table with a half loaf of bread she'd found and managed to revive in the oven. Silas sat down and ate, and it was the first time in 8 months that something set in front of him at that table had tasted like it was made by someone paying attention. He didn't say so. He ate, he thanked her in the clipped way he thanked people, and he went to his study. But that night, for the first time in a long time, he didn't fall asleep at his desk over ledger books. He went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept like a man whose body had finally remembered that rest was something it was allowed. He didn't examine that too closely. Evelyn Reed had arrived in Dry Hollow 6 weeks before she answered Silas's advertisement. She'd come from Abilene with a trunk, a box of her late husband's books, and enough money to last 2 months in the cheapest boarding house in town, which turned out to be a narrow room above the feed store run by a woman named Mrs. Pratt, who charged $3 a week and made it abundantly clear that she extended no credit. Thomas Reed had been dead for 7 months by then. Pneumonia, which had taken him fast, 3 weeks from the first cough to the funeral. He'd been a schoolteacher, which was a fine profession for a man who loved learning, and not a particularly practical one for a family with debt. By the time Evelyn had buried him and settled his accounts, she'd had enough money left to make it to Dry Hollow, where she'd heard there was work, and not much beyond that. What she hadn't counted on was how quickly a town sized you up and filed you away. Dry Hollow wasn't a cruel place, exactly. It was just small, which amounted to nearly the same thing sometimes. A woman alone, no family, no connections, no obvious skills they needed. She became invisible faster than she expected, and not the comfortable kind of invisible. The kind where people see through you, not past you, and make small calculations about your prospects. She'd tried 3 positions before Silas's advertisement, a family that wanted a governess but really wanted a servant for everything, a merchant who decided mid-conversation that she was too young, though he'd been looking at her in a way that told her the real reason was closer to the opposite, a woman at the edge of town who wanted help with laundry and offered $1 a week in exchange. She'd taken the laundry job for 3 weeks and given it up when her hands started cracking from the lie. She had $9 left when she cut Silas's advertisement from the board. She'd stood there for a moment on the dusty sidewalk, holding the paper, and done the arithmetic. 1 more week at Mrs. Pratt's, and then she'd have nothing. Nothing was a very specific feeling. She'd been close to it before, and it had a particular weight to it, heavy and very quiet, like snow. She wasn't afraid of work. She'd never been afraid of work. What she was afraid of was running out of runway before she found somewhere to land. The stage dropped her at the crossroads and drove on without slowing down much, and she stood in the cold wind for a moment, satchel in hand, looking at the track that led toward the mountains and the sign that said Mercer Ranch, 3 miles. 3 miles was 3 miles. She started walking. Her room at the back of the ranch house was, as advertised, small, but it was also warmer than anywhere she'd slept in 2 months. There was a narrow bed with a proper mattress, a chest of drawers, a window that looked out at the horse paddock, and a small iron stove in the corner that, when stoked properly, kept the room at a temperature that didn't require sleeping in your coat. She sat on the edge of the bed that first night after supper was done and the kitchen was clean, and she let herself feel, very briefly, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Relief. Not happiness. Not safety, exactly. Relief. The specific, careful relief of someone who knows things could still go wrong but has found, for the moment, a floor beneath their feet. She unpacked her satchel methodically. A change of clothes, her hairbrush, a small journal with a broken clasp. 3 of Thomas's books that she'd kept because they were the ones he'd loved most, their spines cracked from reading. She set them on the chest of drawers and looked at them for a moment. Then she blew out the lamp and lay down in the dark and listened to the wind against the window, and the sound of horses shifting in the paddock, and the quiet creaking of a big house settling into the cold. She was still awake at midnight, but the lying still was enough. Poco. By the end of the first week, she had learned several things about Silas Mercer. He woke before dawn every morning and was outside before she'd gotten the stove going. He ate breakfast without ceremony. He seemed grateful for it, but didn't show gratitude in the usual ways, didn't compliment the food or make conversation. He showed gratitude by eating everything and by handing her a very specific list of supplies on Friday morning, which meant he'd been thinking about what was needed, which meant he'd been paying attention. He ran his ranch the way he ran himself, efficiently and without much waste. She watched him with his men sometimes through the kitchen window. He wasn't warm with them exactly, but he was fair. He didn't raise his voice. When one of the younger hands, a boy of maybe 17 who had the look of someone recently arrived from harder circumstances, made a mistake with the water trough fittings that flooded a section of the paddock, Silas helped fix it without making a speech about it. The boy's name was Danny. He was grateful in a visible, nearly painful way, and Silas didn't seem to know what to do with that, so he just handed the boy a wrench and got on with the work. She also learned that Silas Mercer had been alone in this house for a long time. Not temporarily alone, not alone between chapters of a fuller life, alone in the way that becomes a habit, a posture, a whole way of moving through rooms. She saw it in small things, the way he was startled when she spoke to him before he'd come fully inside from outdoors, like he'd forgotten someone might. The way he always closed his study door, even when no one was coming down the hall. The single cup, single plate, single set of silverware that had been his default for so long that it hadn't occurred to him to put more out. She put out 2 cups now when she made morning coffee. The first day, he picked his up without comment. The second day, he looked at the second cup, not at her, at the cup. And she saw something move across his face that was too quick to read. The third day, he sat down at the kitchen table to drink it, instead of taking it back to the study. She didn't remark on any of it. There was a kind of pressure that came with being noticed, and she suspected Silas Mercer had been managing that pressure his whole adult life. The last thing he needed was someone pointing out his own behavior to him. The town of Dry Hollow formed its opinion of the situation at the Mercer Ranch in approximately the same amount of time it takes a lit match to find dry grass. Evelyn heard about it first from a woman at the market, a Mrs. Whitfield, wife of the saddle maker, who had a face like a disapproving ledger and the news-gathering habits of a telegraph office. "You're working at the Mercer place," Mrs. Whitfield said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Evelyn said. She was pricing potatoes and trying to calculate how many she could carry back on her own. Mrs. Whitfield's hum was a complete sentence. "And how are you finding it?" "It's good work." "I imagine it is." A pause, weighted and deliberate. "Silas Mercer is a wealthy man, very wealthy, as things go around here." "He pays fair wages," Evelyn said. She selected her potatoes. "I'm sure he does." Another pause. "A woman in your position? Well, one can understand the appeal of a situation that offers more than just wages." Evelyn set down the potato she was holding and looked at Mrs. Whitfield directly. "I cook," she said. "I clean. I manage the household accounts. That is the whole of my position at the Mercer Ranch. If there's a question underneath what you just said, you're welcome to ask it plainly, and I'll give you a plain answer, but I'm not going to stand here and agree with something that was said sideways." Mrs. Whitfield's mouth tightened. "I meant no offense." "I know," Evelyn said, which was the most patient lie she told all week. She paid for her potatoes and walked the 3 miles back to the ranch, and somewhere around the 2-mile mark, her hands stopped shaking. She didn't tell Silas about it. There were things you didn't bring into a house that was trying, cautiously, to be a home. She had been at the ranch for 3 weeks when she first saw the photograph. She was cleaning the front parlor, a room that had the air of a place no one spent time in anymore, formal and a little mournful. And she was dusting the mantelpiece when she found it behind a clock. Not hidden, exactly, just placed where it wouldn't be the first thing you saw. A photograph in a silver frame, a man and a woman standing in front of what was clearly the ranch house, younger than it was now. The man was Silas, 20 years earlier. The bones of him the same, but the set of his jaw different, less guarded. The woman was small and dark-haired and smiling at someone outside the frame rather than at the camera, which gave the photograph a kind of aliveness that formal portraits didn't usually have. Evelyn studied it for a moment, then set it back exactly as she'd found it, frame turned slightly away from the room. That evening, she overheard Silas on the porch talking to his foreman, a weathered man named Cal who'd been with the ranch for 20 years. They were talking about the east fence line, routine things, but then Cal said something she didn't catch, and Silas's response carried through the door clearly. "It's been 8 years, Cal. People need to stop mentioning it." Cal's reply was quiet and indistinct. "I said leave it," Silas said, and that was the end of it. Evelyn went back to the kitchen and finished the dishes and didn't think about the photograph too directly, but she thought about the parlor with the curtains always closed, and the 12-room house with only 4 of them ever in use, and the way Silas sometimes stood at the window at the end of the day, looking at nothing in particular, like a man waiting for something he'd given up expecting. Grief, she knew, wore different clothes on different people. On some it was loud and obvious. On others, it was just a room you stopped using. It was a Tuesday evening, nearly a month after her arrival, when something shifted. She'd made supper, a proper one, roasted chicken with root vegetables, bread that had actually risen properly this time, a cobbler with the last of the preserved peaches she'd found in the cellar. It was the best meal she'd put on the table since she'd arrived, partly because the kitchen had begun to feel like her kitchen rather than a stranger's kitchen, and partly because cooking well was how she managed the days that were harder than others. This was a harder day. The anniversary of something. She didn't explain it to herself too precisely. She just cooked. Silas came in from the barn later than usual, rubbing dust from his hands with a rag. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, looking at the table. "That's more than usual," he said. "I had extra time today." He sat down. She served them both. She had taken to eating in the kitchen with him, at the kitchen table rather than in her room, because eating alone in a small room was something she was rationing carefully. They ate in the usual silence for a while. Then Silas said, without looking up from his plate, "You had a husband." It wasn't quite a question. "Thomas," she said. "He died 7 months before I came here, 8 months before I answered your advertisement." A pause. "What was he like?" She thought about it seriously, the way she felt the question deserved. "He was kind," she said. "Genuinely kind, which is rarer than people act like it is. He was the kind of man who remembered what you'd said 2 months ago and asked about it later. He was bad with money, and he knew it, and he was a little ashamed of it, which I think made it worse. He loved books more than anything, more than was practical." "Is that hard to say?" Silas asked, quietly. "Sometimes," she said. "Tonight more than usual." He nodded. He looked at his hands, then at the cobbler, and then he said something that surprised her. "The photograph on the parlor mantel. Her name was Clara. We were married for 6 years." "I saw the photograph," Evelyn said. She looked like someone who laughed easily. "She did," Silas said. And the way he said it, 2 words, flat and careful, because he hadn't let himself say it out loud in a long time, was one of the most nakedly human things she'd ever heard. They sat with that for a moment, and neither of them tried to make it smaller by talking around it. Eventually, Silas reached over and cut himself a second piece of cobbler, which was as close as he came to paying her a compliment that evening. It was enough. Some things you learn to take in the currency you're given. 3 weeks after that dinner, Cal found her in the kitchen early one morning and stood in the doorway in his careful way that meant he wanted to say something he hadn't practiced enough. "Miss Reed," he said. "Mr. Cal," she said. She'd learned that he liked the formal address, even though he was just Cal to everyone else. "I've been with this ranch for 20 years, he said. "I want you to know that." "I know that. I've seen the man who runs it in a lot of conditions." He paused. "He slept through breakfast twice last week." She waited. "He hasn't done that since before Clara died," Cal said. "Sleeping through breakfast means he's sleeping properly. Means something's—" He stopped, seeming to decide he'd been more specific than he'd meant to. "I just thought you should know." Then he nodded and went back outside. Evelyn stood at the stove for a moment after he left. The coffee was still percolating. The morning light was coming through the window at a low angle, finding the steam rising from the pot. She thought about Thomas, who had also slept like a man at peace when he was happy, deep and unmoving, hard to wake. She thought about 12 rooms, and a parlor with the curtains closed, and a man who ate every supper alone and had somehow made that into a whole way of living. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table. Then she went to knock on the study door because breakfast was going cold, and some things, she had decided, were worth interrupting a person's solitude for. The trouble didn't come from inside the ranch. It came from town, the way most trouble did, gradually at first, and then all at once. She heard it from 3 directions in the same week. Mrs. Whitfield again, with another hum that could have meant anything. The boy at the livery who went quiet when she walked in and didn't go quiet when the other ranch hands came through. A note, unsigned, which told her everything she needed to know about the courage of whoever wrote it, slipped under the door of the back room. The note said, "He's using you. Men like him always have a reason. Don't mistake comfortable for real." She sat on her bed with it and read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the back of Thomas's dictionary, between pages she never used, and didn't take it out again. The question it raised, though, didn't fold up as neatly. She was not naive. She had grown up in a world where men with money understood, sometimes consciously and sometimes not, that money was a kind of gravity. It pulled things toward you, and it was easy to mistake that pull for something it wasn't. She had watched Silas carefully for 6 weeks, and what she'd seen was a man who was careful rather than calculating, guarded rather than manipulative, and quietly lonely in a way that seemed entirely genuine. But watching carefully and being certain were 2 different things. That evening, she set a plate of stew in front of him and sat down across from him, and after a minute she said, "There are people in town who think you hired me for reasons that aren't just cooking." Silas looked up from his plate. He held her gaze for a moment. "I know," he said. "Does that bother you?" "Does it bother you?" he asked. "It depends on whether they're right," she said. Something moved across his face. Not offense, not quite. Something closer to the expression of a man who had been asked a fair question and was deciding whether to give it a fair answer. "I hired you because you walked 3 miles in worn-out boots and told me you didn't steal," he said. That seemed like a person worth employing. A pause. "What's happened since then is a different matter." "What has happened since then?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind was picking up, the kind that came before a weather change. "I don't know yet," he said finally, "but I know it's not what they're saying in town." That was honest. It was also incomplete, and they both knew it. But there are conversations that need more runway than a Tuesday evening allows, and both of them were people who had learned the cost of saying things before you were certain of them. Evelyn nodded. She picked up her fork. "The stew's going cold," she said. "It is," he agreed. They ate in the particular quiet of 2 people who have said something real and agreed, without saying so, to let it settle before they say more. Outside in the last light of the day, the wind moved through the grass on the long slope below the ridge, bending it all in one direction, then another. Silas Mercer's ranch, about 12 rooms, half of them unused, land running east as far as a man could ride in a morning, sat on the valley floor like it had always been there and meant to stay. Neither of them knew, that evening, what was coming. They only knew what had changed already. The house was warmer, not from the stoves, not from the firewood, but from something less definable than that. Something that had moved in quietly, the way real things do, without announcing itself, and had begun, cautiously, unevenly, without any guarantees, to make itself at home. That was enough. For now. It would have to be enough. Because in 3 weeks, a man named Victor Harrow would ride down that same long drive, and he would not be coming in worn-out boots with nothing but honesty in his hand. He would be coming for the land. And what stood between him and it, a wealthy cowboy who had forgotten how to fight for himself, and a widow who had been underestimated her entire life, was still, at this point, learning that it might be worth fighting for each other. The fire in the kitchen stove burned low as the night deepened. Evelyn's boots, the worn heel ones, the ones that had carried her 3 miles down a dirt track to knock on a stranger's gate, were drying by the hearth. Silas's light burned late in the study, as it always did, but tonight there were 2 cups still on the kitchen table, not yet washed. Small things, ordinary things, the kind that, looking back, you realize were the beginning of everything. Victor Harrow's arrival 3 weeks later was, in Evelyn's estimation, the kind of thing that announces itself before it happens. There's a particular quality to the air before a storm, not dramatic, nothing you could point to and say there, just a slight wrongness. The way a room feels different when someone has been in it and left before you arrived. She felt it on a Monday morning when Cal came into the kitchen with the particular set to his jaw that meant he had information he wasn't sure how to deliver. She poured him a cup of coffee without being asked, which was the language they had developed between them. Her offering, him accepting, and somewhere in that exchange the actual conversation becoming possible. "Man rode the fence line yesterday," Cal said. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "East Ridge, then the South Pasture. Spent a long time looking at the ground. What kind of man? The kind that looks at land and sees numbers, Cal said. Dressed well, didn't introduce himself to anyone, which is how you know he wasn't looking to be friendly. Evelyn set the coffee pot back on the stove. Did you tell Silas? Told him last night. Cal paused. He said he'd heard the name before. Harrow. Victor Harrow. Has land up near the Northern Territory. Has a way of getting more of it. He didn't elaborate on what that way was. He didn't need to. The tone said everything. All right, Evelyn said. Cal finished his coffee, set the cup down neatly, and went back out. She watched him cross the yard from the kitchen window. His gait the careful, deliberate walk of a man who had been carrying weight for a long time and had gotten good at making it look effortless. She did not go to Silas with questions. He would talk when he was ready, and pushing a man like Silas before he was ready was like pushing a gate that swung inward. You only closed it tighter. Instead, she made bread. When things felt unstable, she cooked. It was not a romantic impulse. It was practical. People needed to eat regardless of what was coming, and having something warm and useful to do with her hands kept the particular kind of fear that lived in her chest from taking up more room than it deserved. The bread was good that day. Sometimes that was what you got. Silas brought it up at supper, the way he brought up most things, sideways, without preamble, like a man who had been thinking about something for hours and had finally run out of excuses not to say it. You heard about the man on the fence line, he said. Cal mentioned it. His name is Victor Harrow. Silas pushed a piece of bread around his plate. He'd barely touched the food, which told her more than his expression did. He's been buying up ranch land across 3 counties over the past several years, not always in ways people were happy about afterward. What does that mean? Silas looked up. It means that some of the ranchers who sold to him didn't entirely feel they'd had a choice by the time they signed. And he wants this land. He's wanted this land for 2 years. I've had 2 letters from him already. Both of them polite, both of them the kind of polite that's a threat wearing good manners. He set down his fork. I've ignored them both. And now he's riding the fence line himself, Evelyn said, which means he's done being patient. She thought about that. What's special about this land? I mean, specifically, why this ranch and not another one? Silas was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding something. I don't know exactly, he said. The land is good. The water rights are valuable. There's a creek that runs year-round through the east pasture, which is rarer than it sounds in this territory. And there's always been... He stopped. My father used to say there was something in the ground here, not in a mystical sense. He was a practical man. He just meant he'd had people look at the rock formations on the East Ridge, and they'd said things he didn't fully share with me before he died. What kind of things? I don't know, Silas said again, and this time it carried a different weight, the weight of a man who should have asked questions he hadn't asked in time. Evelyn looked at him. He was a man who commanded a great deal of space in any room he occupied, not in a showy way, just in the solid, settled way of someone who had been in charge of things long enough that authority had become part of his posture. But sitting at the kitchen table with a barely touched plate in front of him, he looked suddenly like someone who hadn't entirely decided whether he was ready for what was coming. You're not going to sell, she said. It wasn't a question. No, he said. I'm not. Then it doesn't matter what he wants. You just have to hold. It's not always that simple, he said. I know it's not, she said, but it's where you start. He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression she hadn't quite seen before. Not gratitude, or not only gratitude. Something more like the look of a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just noticed, with a certain amount of confusion, that someone has come to stand beside him. He didn't say anything to it. He picked up his fork and started eating, and she understood that was its own kind of answer. Victor Harrow arrived at the Mercer Ranch on a Thursday afternoon 2 days later, and he came properly this time. Buggy, good horses, a man riding alongside him who had the alert stillness of someone who was paid for uses that weren't discussed in polite company. Evelyn saw them from the kitchen window. She watched Silas come out of the barn to meet them, wiping his hands on a rag, moving without hurry. He had the knack, she'd noticed, of never letting his body show what his mind was doing. Cal materialized somewhere to his left, which was not accidental. She could not hear the conversation from the kitchen. She went on with what she was doing. She was inventorying the cellar stores, which needed doing regardless. But she listened for tone, the way you listen for weather, not the specific words but the shape of the exchange. The The rises and pauses that tell you whether a conversation is going well before you've understood a syllable of it. It was 20 minutes before she heard the buggy leave. Silas came into the kitchen a few minutes after that. He didn't sit. He stood at the window with his back to her for a long moment, and she gave him that moment without interrupting it. "Well?" she finally said. He turned around. "He offered me twice what the land is worth by any standard measure." "What did you say?" "I said no." "How did he take it?" Silas's expression shifted in a way that was subtle but not nothing. "Politely," he said. "That's what bothered me about it. He took it very politely." Evelyn understood that. She'd been around enough people who used courtesy as a weapon to know that the politest refusals were sometimes the most dangerous ones. A man who argues with you is a man who still thinks you might change your mind. A man who accepts your refusal pleasantly and thanks you for your time has already decided to go around you. "What was he like?" she asked. "In person." Silas thought about it. "Expensive," he said, which was an interesting word to choose. Everything about him cost money, and he wanted you to know it without him saying so. The suit, the watch, the way he stood. A pause. The man he brought with him. That one was the most expensive thing there. "Did he threaten you?" "Not in any way you could point to," Silas said. "He complimented the land, talked about fair deals and mutual benefit, said he hoped I'd give his offer more consideration." He paused again. Then he looked at the East Ridge for a long time before he got in the buggy. Just stood there and looked at it, like he was checking something. Evelyn folded the inventory list she'd been holding. "Silas?" "Yes." "The thing your father said about the rock formations on the East Ridge, do you have any of his papers, anything he wrote down?" He looked at her. "He kept records. They're in the study. I haven't gone through them completely." "Maybe it's time," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and she could see him turning something over. Not resistance, exactly, but the particular reluctance of a person who hasn't looked at a dead man's papers because doing so means sitting with the dead man again. "Yes," he said at last. "Maybe it is." The study smelled of dust and old leather and the specific mustiness of papers that had been undisturbed for years. Silas opened the window, which helped somewhat, and began lifting boxes from the bottom shelves while Evelyn took the stacks of ledgers and sorted them by year. She had not been in this room before, so he kept it closed, and she had respected that without discussing it. Now that she was in it, she understood it better. It was not a working room anymore. It was a room he went into to be alone with things he was still figuring out what to do with. His father's maps on one wall. A rifle over the fireplace that was clearly old enough to be the first man's, not Silas's. A cabinet with 2 photographs on it, one of which she recognized as a younger version of the portrait from the parlor. She did not remark on any of it. They worked for 2 hours, mostly in silence with the occasional practical exchange. "This ledger is dated 82. Does that matter?" "Probably not. Set it aside." And then Evelyn found, at the bottom of a wooden box behind a stack of tax records, a leather folder tied with a cord. "Silas?" He looked up from across the room. She held it up. He came over and stood beside her and undid the cord, and they looked at what was inside together. It was a collection of documents, letters mostly, and 2 hand-drawn maps of the East Ridge with notations in a neat hand she didn't recognize. There were 3 letters from someone who signed himself H. Weston, and though the handwriting was technical and she was not a geologist, the letter dated the furthest back, 1869, was clear enough even to a layperson. The formations on the Eastern Ridge are consistent with what we have observed in the Wyoming territories near the Sweetwater region. I am reluctant to make formal assessments without further survey work, but I believe it is worth your attention. There is significant likelihood of mineral deposits of considerable value. I would urge discretion in sharing this assessment broadly. Evelyn read it. Then she read it again. Silas had gone very still beside her. "Your father knew," she said. "He suspected," Silas said. His voice was carefully level, the voice of a man keeping something contained. "Or someone suspected. I don't know what he did with this. Whether he followed up." A pause. "Whether Harrow knows." She looked at the map. The East Ridge was marked with notations she couldn't fully read, but the area of interest was circled clearly. If Harrow has any kind of contacts in the Geological Survey, or anyone who's looked at public land records and knows what to look for, she began. "Then he knows what's there," Silas said, finishing it, "or suspects. And he's been making offers for 2 years, and I've been saying no, and now he's moved from letters to showing up. He set the folder down on the desk. It wasn't about the water rights. No, Evelyn said. He stood there for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through the open window at a low angle, making the dust motes visible, catching the edge of the map. If I'd sold, he said. If I'd taken the first offer. You didn't, she said. No. He looked at the map again. No, I didn't. She waited, because there was clearly something else working through him, and she'd learned that Silas Mercer's thinking had visible stages if you gave it space. My father built this ranch, he said finally, not because there was mineral wealth in the ground. He didn't know that for certain, or if he did, he never acted on it. He built it because he liked this valley and this land, and he was willing to work hard enough to hold on to it. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't grow up thinking I was sitting on a fortune. I grew up thinking I was sitting on something worth keeping because it had been kept. It's still that, Evelyn said. I know. He folded the papers back into the folder, carefully. The way you treat something you've just understood matters more than you thought. I know that, but now there's a man out there who's going to come back, and he's going to come back harder, and he knows something I only just found out about my own land. So now you know it too, Evelyn said. That's not nothing. He looked at her. There was something in it, not the quick glancing acknowledgement he usually offered, but something that held for a moment that seemed to actually land. No, he said, it's not nothing. What changed in the weeks following was not dramatic, on the surface. The ranch ran. The cattle were moved between pastures. The fence repairs that Cal had been scheduling got done. Danny, the young hand with the grateful eyes, turned out to have a real instinct for horses, and Silas quietly started giving him more responsibility without making a formal thing of it. But underneath the routine, something was tightening. It started with small things. A section of fence on the east boundary that had been intact was found cut, clean cut, not broken. Silas looked at it without saying much and had it repaired and posted one of the hands to check it regularly. A week later, 3 of the neighboring ranchers sent word, not in writing, which told Silas something, that a man matching Harrow's description had been visiting, making inquiries, asking particular questions about who owned what land and how long they'd held their notes at the bank. The bank part was the piece that kept Silas up one night. He told her about it the next morning over coffee. The sun was barely up, and he'd clearly been awake for a while already. There were lines in his face that hadn't been there the night before, the specific lines of a man who has done math in the dark and not liked the answer. I don't carry debt, he said. The ranch is free and clear, has been for 15 years, so the bank angle doesn't touch me directly. He turned the cup in his hands. But 3 of the ranchers to the south aren't in the same position. They've got notes outstanding. If Harrow gets friendly with whoever holds those notes, he pressures them, they sell, and he starts surrounding you, Evelyn said. That's how it's been done before, Silas said. In other places. You don't take the land you want first. You take everything around it, and then you make a man feel like an island. She thought about this. Who are the ranchers? Hadley, to the south. Brothers named Colton, there's 2 of them, share a property line with my west boundary, and a widow woman named Hatch who's been there longer than anyone. He paused. She's 73 years old, and she's run that place alone for 12 years, and I don't think she'll be easily moved. But that doesn't mean he won't try. Have you talked to them since Harrow started making his rounds? Hadley came to me. He's worried. The Colton brothers... He stopped, something working across his expression. We've had disagreements in the past. We're not enemies, but we're not friendly. I don't know if they'd listen to me. It might not be about whether they like you, Evelyn said. It might just be about whether they want to keep their land. He looked at her, and she could tell this was a thought he'd had and set aside, and hearing it said aloud gave it different weight. You think I should go talk to them, he said. I think if Harrow is building a wall around you, the people in that wall might not know they're the wall, she said, and that's information worth sharing. He was quiet. Outside, she could hear Danny in the yard talking to one of the horses in the low, steady voice he used with them. Not quite words, just a murmur that the horses seemed to find settling. You're not wrong, Silas said at last. He didn't say it with particular enthusiasm, which she understood. Going to his neighbors, hat in hand, asking for a coalition, that wasn't how a man who had built his life on self-sufficiency was wired. But being wired one way and doing the necessary thing were not mutually exclusive. I know, she said. I'll ride to Hadley's this afternoon, he said. The Coltons. He picked up his coffee. I'll think about the Coltons. Don't think too long, she said. He gave her a look that, from another man, would have been the beginning of an argument. From Silas, it was something closer to acknowledgement. He finished his coffee, set the cup down, and went to put his boots on. The town's opinion of Evelyn Reed had not improved with time, which she'd expected, but it had changed in character, which she hadn't entirely anticipated. In the first weeks, the talk had been mostly speculative. A lonely, wealthy man, a convenient widow, the usual calculations people made when they saw an arrangement they couldn't categorize cleanly. That kind of talk was unpleasant, but familiar. She'd developed a relationship with unpleasant and familiar that was not comfortable, but was at least navigable. What shifted was harder to handle. It was a Saturday morning, mid-November, and she'd come into town for supplies. She was at Garrett's general store, working through her list, when she became aware of two women on the other side of a display of canned goods who were not quite whispering. 3 months now, and nobody says anything about it. Well, what do you expect? He's wealthy, so naturally. She had nothing when she came here, you understand. Absolutely nothing. And now look. She turned the corner of the display. Both women stopped talking and looked at her with the particular expression of people who have been caught and are deciding whether to be embarrassed or defiant. They were both women she knew by sight, wives of men who did business with the ranch. Women who, if she'd been married to a man with a house in town and a steady position, would have been perfectly pleasant to her. She looked at them for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said, quietly. "Were you talking about me?" The taller of the two, Mrs. Fenner, wife of the dry goods merchant, lifted her chin slightly. "We were having a private conversation." "You were having it quite close to me," Evelyn said, "so I want to make sure I've understood. You think I'm with Silas Mercer for his money." A silence. "I think," Mrs. Fenner said, "that a woman in your circumstances couldn't be blamed for making practical choices." "No," Evelyn said. "I work for a fair wage doing honest work. That's not a practical choice. It's just a job." The distinction seems to be giving some people difficulty, but it's actually quite simple. She looked at the other woman, Mrs. Tully, whose husband ran the mill, and then back. "Silas Mercer is a good employer. He's also a man who's had a hard decade and doesn't deserve to be talked about, as though he can't tell the difference between someone who wants his company and someone who wants his money." She paused. "Neither do I, for that matter." She bought her supplies. She thanked Mr. Garrett, who had the grace to look mildly uncomfortable at having witnessed the exchange. She loaded her basket and walked out. On the way back to the ranch, the anger burned for about a mile and then settled into something quieter and less useful, which was just the awareness that this was not going to stop. Small towns had long memories and short charity, and she was a woman without a history here, which meant people filled the empty space with their own stories about her. What she hadn't expected was that it would bother her as much as it did, not the opinions themselves. She'd made her peace with other people's opinions a long time ago. What bothered her was the direction of it, the assumption that she was using Silas, because whatever complicated thing was developing between them, whatever it was she felt when she heard his boots on the porch in the evening or saw him stand in the kitchen doorway looking at the table with that almost invisible softening around his eyes, it was not strategy, it was not calculation. It was something she hadn't had room for in 8 months of grief and survival, something that had come back uninvited and made her feel slightly off balance, the way you feel when you've been standing in cold water long enough that you've forgotten the cold, and then you step out and realize how warm the air is. That was not a thing she was going to say to Mrs. Fenner in Garrett's general store, but she thought about it most of the way home. She told Silas about it that evening. She hadn't planned to. It felt like a small thing that didn't need adding to his list of concerns. But they were sitting on the porch after supper, which was a thing they'd started doing when the evenings were mild enough. And in the particular quiet of that kind of evening, things came out that didn't quite make it out in busier moments. He listened without interrupting, which was very much his way. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. The horses in the far paddock were moving in the dusk, their shapes dark against the lighter dark of the sky. "I'm sorry," he said. "You don't need to be sorry for what other people say." "No," he agreed, "but I should have—" He stopped. "I should have thought more carefully about your position, about what it looks like to people. I don't need you to manage my position," she said. Not sharply. She was genuinely not angry or not at him. "I can manage my own position." "I know you can," he said. "That's not what I—" He exhaled. "I'm not saying it well." Then say it differently. He looked at the paddock for a moment. It's not right, he said, that you came here and did good work, and the town's decided to make a story out of it that has nothing to do with who you are. And I know you can handle it. I've watched you handle worse. But the fact that you can handle it doesn't mean you should have to. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the horses, his jaw set in the particular way it was when he was being careful. That's the most you've said about how you think of me, she said. I know, he said. He was quiet again, then, I'm working up to it. She almost laughed, not because it was funny, exactly, but because it was so entirely Silas. The honesty of it, the almost awkward plainness of it, a wealthy man who could have anything and had spent years not knowing how to say he wanted something. All right, she said. All right, he repeated. They sat with that for a while. The night came down over the valley in that way it did in autumn. Not gradually exactly, but in stages, the light changing by degrees until you looked up and it was simply dark. She was not sure what she felt sitting there. It was not uncomplicated. She still had Thomas's books on her dresser. She still had mornings where the grief was a weight rather than a memory, where she reached for something that wasn't there anymore, and the absence of it was specific and particular and belonged to no one else. She was not over anything. She was not ready for anything. She was just here, on a porch she hadn't known existed 3 months ago, next to a man who was working up to something. And that was a true sentence about her life, and it coexisted somehow with all the other true sentences. It's going to get worse, Silas said after a while, with Harrow, before it gets better. I know, she said. I want you to know... He stopped, started again. If things get difficult, if it stops feeling safe, I don't expect you to stay for something that isn't your fight. She turned and looked at him squarely. He was looking at her now, and she met it. Silas, she said, I walked 3 miles to knock on your gate. I think we've established that I don't go somewhere unless I mean to. He held her gaze for a moment. That's fair, he said. It is, she agreed. They went inside shortly after. The dishes needed doing. The stove needed banking for the night. Danny had left a note about one of the mares that needed looking at in the morning. These were the actual contents of the evening, the practical, ordinary substance of it. But somewhere underneath all that, something had been said, not loudly, not with the kind of language that gets written down. Just said, the way important things often are, quietly, in the dark, between two people who are being careful with each other and figuring out slowly that maybe they don't have to be quite so careful anymore. Neither of them slept particularly well that night, for different reasons that were probably, when examined closely, the same reason. Cal found the second cut fence on a Wednesday morning, and this one was different. Not just cut. The posts had been pulled, 3 of them, which meant it wasn't vandalism exactly, it was a statement. Someone had spent time on it. The section was on the east boundary, the boundary that ran closest to the ridge, and a section of it was down completely, which meant 3 of the younger cattle had gotten through into the rocky ground where they shouldn't be. It took most of the morning to get the cattle back, and 2 of the hands most of the afternoon to repair the section properly. Silas worked alongside them, which he always did. He was not a man who managed from a distance, and by the time it was done, his hands were raw from the wire and the cold, and his jaw had the particular set that meant he was doing his arithmetic again. He came in for supper quieter than usual. The east boundary, Evelyn said. Yes. Same place as before? Close to it. He sat down. She set a plate in front of him. Whoever is doing it knows the land. Knows where the ridge is, she said. Knows where I'd feel it most, he said. He picked up his fork, put it back down. I rode up to the ridge this afternoon, after we fixed the fence. She sat down across from him. And? I'm not a geologist, he said. But I took the letter, Weston's letter, and I looked at what he described and I looked at what's there. He was quiet for a moment. The formations he was talking about, they're obvious once you know to look at them. I don't know why my father didn't do more with this information. Maybe he was cautious. Maybe he didn't want to deal with what it would bring. Another pause. I understand that better now. What does it mean, practically? It means that if what's in those formations is what Weston thought it was, and I think it might be, I think Harrow's surveyor told him what's there, then this land is worth a great deal more than Harrow's offered. He looked at her. And it means Harrow has been undercutting the value by design. He knows what's there. He knows I didn't know. And he's been making offers that are generous by any surface measure, Generous enough that I couldn't complain, but are a fraction of the actual value. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moving through the eaves. He's not buying land, she said. He's buying a mine. Yes, Silas said. And destroying the fence is pressure, Silas said. Saying you can't hold this without saying it in words. She looked at him. He was tired. Genuinely tired. Not physically, but in the way that people get tired when they are being required to think about too many things at once, and most of them are things they'd rather not be thinking about. The lines in his face were deeper than they'd been 2 months ago. He was eating less than he should. You need to talk to a lawyer, she said. I know. And you need to talk to the neighbors, not just Hadley. All of them. I know, he said again. And you need to eat your supper, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a loosening. Yes, he said. That too. He picked up his fork and began to eat, and she watched him, and the fire in the stove made a settling sound, and outside the wind kept moving across the valley over the land that was more valuable than anyone had said, and that a man named Harrow wanted badly enough to start dismantling fences in the night. The supper was venison stew, which was not fancy. It was just hot and filling, and made with some attention, and that was what the evening called for. Silas ate all of it, which was something. She took that too, in the currency she was given. Plus, the letter came on a Friday. It was on the same fine paper as the previous ones, written in the same controlled hand, signed V. Harrow, with the kind of signature that practiced itself in mirrors. It was polite. It was thorough. It made an offer that was higher than the previous ones. And at the very end, below the formal close, there was a single additional line, smaller than the rest, almost an afterthought in presentation if not in intent. I trust the recent difficulties with the east boundary have not caused undue inconvenience. The frontier can be unpredictable in its demands on a man's time and attention. I do hope you will find occasion to reconsider. Silas read it twice, then handed it across the table to Evelyn without a word. She read it. Set it down. He's telling you he did it, she said. He's telling me he knows about it, Silas said, which is the same thing. What are you going to do? He was silent for a moment, and then he looked up, and she saw something in his expression that she hadn't seen before. Not fear, not anger exactly, but something beneath both of those, something settled and final, the expression of a man who has been deliberating for a long time and has just stopped. Fight him, Silas said. It was 2 words. They were not delivered dramatically or loudly. They were just said, flat and plain, the way a fact is stated. Evelyn looked at him across the table. All right, she said, and that was where it stood. The stove crackled. The letter sat between them on the table, smooth and well-penned and carefully threatening. Silas reached over and folded it in half. Then he set it aside and asked if there was any coffee left, because there was still the rest of the evening to get through. And things needed thinking about, and thinking went better with something warm to hold on to. She got up to pour it. They had a great deal of work ahead of them, and neither of them was entirely certain how it would go, and that was simply the truth of where they were. It was not a comfortable place, but they were in it together, which was different from being in it alone. It was, at this point, enough. The lawyer's name was Edmund Ferris, and he operated out of a small office above the telegraph station in Dry Hollow that smelled permanently of pipe tobacco and old paper. He was a thin man in his late 50s, with the kind of careful eyes that read everything twice. Contracts, faces, the space between what people said and what they meant. He had practiced law in the territory for 23 years, which meant he had seen most varieties of human trouble and had developed, over time, a professional calm that Silas found either reassuring or maddening depending on the day. Silas laid out the situation methodically, the way he laid out any problem, chronologically, without embellishment, letting the facts carry their own weight. The letters from Harrow, the fence cuts, the geological documents from his father's papers, the final letter with its barely veiled reference to the east boundary damage. Ferris listened with his hands folded on the desk and his pipe unlit beside him. He did not interrupt. When Silas finished, Ferris picked up Weston's letter, the geological assessment from 1869, and read it slowly. Then he set it down and read the last letter from Harrow, the one with the additional line at the bottom. That line at the end, Ferris said. Yes, Silas said. He's careful, Ferris said. It doesn't say he did anything. It only says he knows about it. That distinction matters legally. I know it does, Silas said. That's why I'm here. Ferris leaned back. The geological assessment is interesting, very interesting. Have you had anyone verify it recently? A current survey? Not yet. You'll need one. Weston's letter is 50 years old. A good foundation, but it needs to be supported by current findings before it's worth anything in a legal context. He paused. There's a surveying firm out of Santa Fe that does mineral assessments. Reputable. Discreet, which matters in your situation. I can write to them. How long would that take? 3 weeks for them to arrive. Another week on the land. Then a report. Ferris looked at him steadily. 6 weeks, minimum? Possibly more. 6 weeks is a long time, Silas said. It is, Ferris agreed. But going into any proceeding, legal or otherwise, without documentation of what the land is actually worth, is going to cost you more than 6 weeks if things go wrong. Silas was quiet, turning his hat in his hands. He'd been doing that since he sat down, turning it slowly, not from nerves exactly, but the way a man does when he's processing something and needs his hands occupied. What about the fence damage, he said. The intimidation. Document everything from this point forward, Ferris said. Every incident, date, time, description, any witnesses. If the pattern continues, and I suspect it will, that becomes evidence of a campaign rather than isolated incidents. He paused. The letter is useful, not because of what it says, but because he wrote it at all. A man as careful as Harrow doesn't put anything on paper unless he's confident he can't be touched. That confidence can become a liability. He thinks I won't push back, Silas said. He thinks you can't afford to, Ferris said. There's a difference, and it's worth understanding. He's not underestimating your will. He's calculating your resources. His assumption is that legal action costs money and time, and most ranchers eventually fold under the weight of it, not because they're cowards, but because they have cattle to run and hay to buy, and they can't afford to spend 3 years in a courtroom. Ferris looked at him. Can you? If it comes to that. Then you have an advantage he hasn't accounted for. The lawyer allowed himself the smallest possible version of a dry smile. I'll write to Santa Fe this afternoon. Silas rode back from town with the cold November wind at his back, and he thought about what Ferris had said. He thinks you can't afford to. And he turned it over the way he turned the hat in his hands, looking for the sides of it. He was not a man who thought of himself primarily in terms of money. He'd grown up with it. His father had built the ranch from almost nothing, yes, but by the time Silas was old enough to understand finance, the Mercer name meant something in Dry Hollow Valley, and the bank treated him with the particular courtesy reserved for men who didn't urgently need the bank's help. He'd understood, in an abstract way, that this was an advantage, but he hadn't understood it the way he understood it now, as a weapon that could be used in both directions. Harrow had money, a great deal more of it probably, if his holdings across 3 counties were anything close to what people said. But Harrow had spent 2 years maneuvering, cutting fences, writing careful letters, building pressure in circles around the thing he actually wanted, because he'd calculated that a direct fight with Silas Mercer was a fight he might not win quickly, and quick was the only way it worked. Let it go long, let it go loud, and things got complicated. Harrow needed this resolved quietly and fast. That was the thing Silas held on to on the ride home. He unsaddled his horse, brushed him down, put him in the stall. Danny was working on the far end of the stable, and he looked up when Silas came in. "Everything all right?" Danny asked. He had the instinct of young people who've grown up reading rooms, the constant alertness of someone who learned early that the atmosphere of a place was information. "Working on it," Silas said. Danny nodded and went back to his work, and Silas appreciated the lack of follow-up questions. He told Evelyn about Ferris that evening, going through it methodically, the way he told Ferris, and she listened in the particular way she had, not passive, but active in her stillness, everything in her face engaged while her body stayed quiet. 6 weeks, she said, when he finished. Minimum. Can you keep the ranch running normally through 6 weeks of this? By this she meant whatever form Harrow's pressure was going to take next, and they both understood that. Cal's good, Silas said. The men are solid. The operation itself isn't the problem. What is the problem? He was quiet for a moment. The neighbors, he said. I went to see the Coltons last week. She had known he'd gone. She hadn't asked. How did it go? Not well, he said, with the flat honesty he applied to things that hadn't gone well. Owen Colton, the older one, He's already had a meeting with one of Harrow's people, someone who came with papers, an offer, made it sound like an opportunity. He exhaled slowly. Owen's scared. He's got debt on the property and a bad season behind him, and Harrow's man knew both of those things when he sat down at Owen's table, which means Harrow's done his homework. Did Owen listen to you? He listened, Silas said. Whether he heard me is different. His brother, the younger one, Ned's angrier. Angrier is sometimes easier to work with. Anger at least means he's not ready to give up. He turned the cup in his hands. I told them both what I knew about Harrow's pattern, how he works, what he's actually after on the East Ridge. And Owen said he'd think about it. The way Silas said it communicated clearly that I'll think about it from a frightened man meant something between probably not, and I don't know yet. Ned said he wanted to know more about the legal options. That's something. It's something, Silas agreed. He didn't say it with conviction, but he said it. She refilled their coffee cups and sat back down, and there was a quiet between them that was not empty. It was the particular quiet of two people thinking about the same problem from their respective angles, and occasionally, without discussing it, arriving at similar places. The widow, Evelyn said. Mrs. Hatch. I'm going to see her Friday, Silas said. He considered his words. She's not someone who needs to be persuaded of anything. She already knows Harrow for what he is. She had a conversation with one of his men that apparently did not go the way Harrow expected. What happened? Something moved across Silas's face that was the closest he came to genuine amusement. She told him he could take his offer and use it to line his barn floor, he said. In those words, apparently, Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest. Not laughter, but the relief that was sometimes adjacent to it. I'd like to meet her. I'll bring you on Friday, Silas said. It was said simply, without a second thought, and she noticed that the easy way he said you and Friday as though it were obvious, as though the question of her being part of this had been settled somewhere along the way without either of them making a formal decision about it. She noticed it and did not remark on it. All right, she said. Mrs. Adeline Hatch was 73 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, and had the general demeanor of a woman who had outlasted several varieties of difficulty and found each subsequent one somewhat less impressive than the last. Her ranch was smaller than Silas's, but immaculate. The kind of property where you could see the care in every fence post, every outbuilding, the yard swept clean and the woodpiles stacked with the precision of someone who understood that small disciplines kept larger things from falling apart. She met them at the door before they'd fully dismounted, which suggested she'd been watching from the window, which Evelyn respected. Silas Mercer, she said, looking up at him. You look tired. Good afternoon, Mrs. Hatch. Is it? She was already looking at Evelyn. Who's this? Evelyn Reed. She manages the household at the ranch. Mrs. Hatch looked at Evelyn with the direct, unvarnished assessment of someone who had long since given up on social niceties as a way of determining anything useful about a person. You're the widow woman, she said. Yes, Evelyn said. Come in, then. She turned back into the house. I've got coffee, and I've got opinions about Victor Harrow, and you're welcome to both. The kitchen was warm and low-ceilinged and smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. Mrs. Hatch poured coffee into cups that didn't match. She had the air of a woman who had either never cared about matched sets or had cared for a long time and then stopped, and sat down across from them at a table that had probably seated a family before it seated just her. He sent a man, she said, without preamble. Polite young man with clean boots and dirty intentions. Told me the offer was generous. I told him what I told you I told him. I heard, Silas said. He'll send someone else, she said. He always does. Second time, the offer's higher. Third time, it's not an offer anymore. She wrapped both hands around her cup. I know because the Haggerty family, southwest of you, Silas, they sold 2 years ago. They told me how it went. The third man who came didn't have an offer. He had a list of problems with their water rights that would have cost them more to fight than the sale was worth. She looked at Silas steadily. Someone had gotten into the county records and found an old filing discrepancy. Small thing, made large. Evelyn and Silas exchanged a look across the table. Is your title clear? Silas asked. I've had Ferris look at it twice, she said. It's clean. But that's not the point, is it? The point is that Harrow manufactures problems whether they exist or not, and then he shows up as the easiest solution to problems of his own making. She took a sip of her coffee. What are you planning to do? Silas laid it out for her. Ferris, the surveying firm, the documentation, the approach to the neighboring ranchers. She listened without interrupting, which was, Evelyn suspected, an unusual behavior for Mrs. Hatch that indicated she was taking this seriously. When he finished, the old woman was quiet for a moment. "The Coltons," she said. "Owen's wavering," Silas said. "Owen's always wavering," she said, not unkindly. "He's a good man, but he's one of those people who can see every side of a situation, which is useful in peacetime and paralyzing otherwise." She set down her cup. "Ned will hold if Owen holds. The question is how long Owen can hold before he makes a decision just to stop sitting with the uncertainty." "I know," Silas said. Silas. "You need to give him a reason that's more concrete than don't sell, trust me," she said. "He needs to see the thing. The legal strategy, the survey, the coalition, laid out in front of him like a plan, not a hope." Silas nodded slowly. "I'm working on having those pieces in place. Work faster," she said. Not harshly, just plainly. Evelyn spoke for the first time since they'd sat down. "Mrs. Hatch, would you be willing to come to the Coltons with us? If we arrange a meeting?" The old woman looked at her. "The Coltons respect you," Evelyn said, "or at least they respect how long you've held your land. And Silas coming to Owen's table alone is one man making an argument. Silas coming with you, with a plan and documentation. That's different." Mrs. Hatch was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Silas. "Your housekeeper has good sense," she said. "She does," he agreed, without hesitation. The old woman nodded once. "I'll come to the meeting," she said. "Make it soon." They were 3 miles from the ranch on the ride back when Silas said, without looking at her, "Thank you for that." "For what?" "For asking her directly. I was going around to it." He kept his eyes on the road. "I would have gotten there, but you would have talked about the legal strategy for another 10 minutes first," Evelyn said. "Probably," he admitted. She smiled, though he wasn't looking. They rode in companionable silence for a while. The late afternoon light was long and thin. The shadows of the horses stretched out ahead of them on the track, and the valley floor was that particular color of November. Not beautiful exactly, but the kind of austere that has its own integrity. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The mineral assessment. If it comes back the way Weston's letter suggested, if the land is worth what it might be worth, what do you do with that? After all of this is resolved?" He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't give reflexive answers. "I don't know," he said honestly. "My father didn't act on it. I've been here 30 years managing cattle and land, and I know what I know how to do." A pause. "There's something unsettling about suddenly being, potentially, a different kind of rich than you were yesterday. The land was worth what it was worth. I knew what that was. You add mineral rights of that magnitude, and it's a different number, and it changes things." "Does it change this?" she asked. She meant the ranch, the valley, the kitchen table, the second coffee cup, the porch in the evenings. He looked at her then, turning in the saddle slightly. "No," he said, "it doesn't change this." She held his gaze for a moment. "Good," she said. They rode the rest of the way home in the kind of quiet that is the opposite of empty. The surveying team from Santa Fe arrived on a Tuesday. 3 men, professional and self-contained, with equipment that Cal eyed with the cautious interest of a man who didn't entirely trust things he didn't understand. They set up camp at the edge of the east pasture and began their work the following morning, and Silas instructed everyone on the ranch not to discuss their presence or purpose with anyone outside the property. What Silas had not accounted for, what none of them had accounted for, was how quickly Harrow would notice. It was Cal who saw it first, a rider on the ridge above the east pasture, not doing anything, just watching. He was there for 2 hours on the first morning of the survey and gone by midday. By the second morning, there were 2 of them. Cal reported this to Silas at breakfast, in the careful way he had. Silas's jaw did the thing it did. "He's got eyes on the ranch," Silas said. "More than one pair," Cal said. "He knows why they're here," Evelyn said from the stove. Both men looked at her. "He knows what a survey team looks like. He's been through this before on other people's land." She turned around. "He knows you found the Weston documents, or he suspects it, and he knows that if the survey confirms what Weston assessed, his window closes." Silas looked at Cal. Cal looked at the floor, then at Silas. "How long will he wait?" Cal asked. "He won't wait," Silas said. "That's the answer. He's been patient for 2 years and it hasn't worked. Now he's watching men with survey equipment on my East Ridge, and he knows what that means." He pushed back from the table. "He'll move soon. I don't know what form it takes, but he'll move. He was right. He just underestimated how soon. It was 11 days after the survey team arrived. A Wednesday night, clear and cold, the stars very bright. The kind of night where sound carries further than it should. Evelyn woke to the smell first. Not sound, smell. A particular smell, dense and sharp. The smell of burning wood, but with something underneath it, something chemical and wrong. She was at the window before she was fully awake. The barn was on fire. Not catching fire, fully, catastrophically on fire, the way a barn goes when someone does not want it to go slowly. The north wall was already a curtain of flame from ground to roof. The interior visible through the gaps as a roiling mass of orange and black, and even from the house she could hear the sound of it. Not crackling, but a deep, constant roar, the sound of something consuming itself with extreme efficiency. She was out the door in her nightclothes before she'd made a conscious decision to move. She could hear the horses, the ones in the stable on the other side of the yard from the barn, the sound high and desperate. She could hear men shouting, Cal's voice clear and commanding above the rest. She could see Silas already in the yard, already pulling at the stable door. The horses were her first thought. Not the barn, not the tack, not the feed that represented weeks of stock. The horses, because they were terrified, and they were in a building adjacent to the burning one, and they had no way of understanding what was happening to them. She ran to the stable door. Silas was on the other side of it, and for a moment they were both pulling, and then the door gave, and they stumbled back, and the horses came, not in an orderly way, not in any way anyone could have organized, but in the panicked surge of large animals that had decided they needed to be somewhere else immediately. She pressed herself against the fence and let them pass, and Silas did the same. And Danny, who had materialized from somewhere, his shirt untucked, his face white with shock, got the gate of the far paddock open, and the horses went toward the dark and the open space and the air that wasn't on fire. The barn could not be saved. Silas assessed this within the first 5 minutes. They all did. And the work became containment. Men with buckets, men with shovels, a human chain running water from the trough, all of it buying time until the thing burned itself down rather than spread. Cal worked with the particular competence of someone who has kept himself useful in enough emergencies to have stopped being afraid of them. Danny was everywhere at once, doing whatever needed doing, his hands blistered before the night was half over. Evelyn carried water. It was not enough. Nothing was enough against something that size, but it was what there was to do, and she did it until her arms stopped feeling like arms. By 2 a.m, the fire had burned itself down to a structure of black timbers and ash and ruin, still giving off heat visible in waves, the smell of it everywhere, coating everything, impossible to get away from. The horses were safe. The stable was intact, barely. The tack room had taken smoke damage, but not fire. The barn, the hay, the equipment stored inside, the loft where Danny had been sleeping 3 weeks ago before Silas had moved him to the bunkhouse, was gone. Silas stood at the edge of what remained, his face black with smoke, his hands burned at the knuckles from where he'd been on the water line. He stood there for a long time, and nobody spoke to him, which was correct. Evelyn came to stand beside him eventually. She didn't say anything either. She just stood there in the ruin light, smelling of smoke, her hair falling down from where it had come unpinned at some point in the night. Finally, Silas said, "It wasn't an accident." "No," she said. "There was an accelerant. You could smell it when it first went up." He said it without emotion, the way he said things when the emotion was underneath the words rather than in them. "Someone laid this deliberately. I know." He looked at what was left of the barn for another long moment. "My father built that," he said. "Before the house, even. He built the barn first because he said you house the animals before you house yourself." She didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything to say to it that wouldn't diminish it. She just stood there. After a while, he said, "He wants me to fold." "Yes," she said. "He wants me to look at this and decide that the cost of holding is higher than the cost of letting go." "Yes." "He's wrong," Silas said. It was not defiant. It was not loud. It was the tone of a conclusion reached after a long examination of the evidence, a thing simply stated. "I know he is," Evelyn said. He looked at her then. His face was tired in the bone-deep way that goes beyond a night's sleep, tired in the way that comes from years of managing things alone, and then one long night of watching something his father built burn to the ground. He looked like a man who was still standing only because he'd decided, somewhere in the last few hours, that sitting down would cost too much. She held his gaze. I'm not leaving, she said, unprompted. Clearly. Not because he'd asked, but because she could see that he needed to hear it said plainly without him having to ask for it. I said I don't go somewhere unless I mean to. I meant it. Something shifted in his face. It was not relief exactly, or not only relief. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying something alone and has had it taken very briefly from his hands. I know, he said. His voice was rougher than usual, and not only from the smoke. Cal appeared behind them, rubbing ash from his forearms. Horses are settled, he said. Danny's keeping watch on the paddock. No damage beyond the barn and some smoke to the tack room. The surveying team, Silas asked. Their camp's intact. Fire didn't reach the east pasture. Silas nodded. Get the men some rest. We'll assess in the morning. Cal nodded and went. Silas looked back at the ruin once more, and then he turned away from it. Not running, not refusing to see it, just turning away because looking at it longer wasn't going to change what it was. Come inside, Evelyn said. Your hands need looking at. They're fine. They're burned, she said. Come inside. He came inside. She cleaned his hands at the kitchen table. The knuckles and the left palm, where the worst of it was, with water and the medical kit she'd located in the first week and reorganized because the previous arrangement made no sense. He sat very still while she worked, which was either because the burns hurt or because he was far away in his head, or both. Harrow will expect you to come to him now, she said, while she worked. He'll expect you to send word that you're ready to talk terms. I know. Don't! I'm not going to. I know you're not, she said. I'm saying it anyway because it helps me to say it. She finished with the left hand, set it down carefully. What are you going to do instead? Tomorrow morning, he said. I'm going to send letters to Hadley and Mrs. Hatch and the Coltons. I'm going to ask them to come here, all of them, at the same time. And I'm going to show them what I know about Harrow's methods, what the surveying team is going to find, what Ferris's strategy is. He looked at his bandaged hands. And then I'm going to ask them if they're willing to stand with me. They'll come, she said. You don't know that. They'll come, she said again, because that barn didn't burn itself, and everyone in this valley knows it, and people who have been frightened for a long time will sometimes move toward the person who decides to stop being frightened. She looked at him. That's you right now, whether you feel it or not. He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm. The lamp on the table threw its small light, and outside the sky was beginning to move from black toward the dark gray that comes before dawn, which meant they had been up all night and the morning was nearly here. I don't feel particularly brave, he said, in case that matters. It doesn't, she said. Brave is what you do, not how you feel while you're doing it. He looked at her. This time the look lasted long enough that she was aware of it not as a glance, but as something deliberate, something that had weight to it. Evelyn, he said. Yes. He seemed to be working up to something, the same way she'd seen him work up to things before, organizing his words, finding the floor beneath them before he stepped onto them. But before he could get there, Danny knocked on the back door. Mr. Mercer, sorry, one of the mares is acting up. Thinks she's still scared from the fire. I don't know if I should. I'll come, Silas said. He stood, looked at Evelyn once more with the expression of a man who has been interrupted mid-sentence and is aware of it, and went. She sat at the kitchen table alone for a moment. In the warm kitchen, the lamp still burning, the faint smell of smoke embedded in everything, including herself. Outside, the sky was definitively lighter now. She got up and put the kettle on, because the morning was coming and the men would need coffee, and there was, regardless of everything else, a day to get through. But she was aware, sitting down again to wait for the water to heat, of what Silas had been about to say. She didn't know the exact words, but she knew the shape of them, the direction of them, the way you know where a path leads before you've walked to the end of it. She thought she could wait for them a little longer. He would get there. They both would. The surveying team found what Weston's letter had predicted. Their lead surveyor, a compact and meticulous man named Garrett, who seemed constitutionally incapable of either understating or overstating anything, laid their preliminary findings on the table in Silas's study on the 5th day after the barn fire. He spoke in technical language first, then, at Silas's request, in plain terms. Plain terms were these. The mineral deposits in the eastern ridge formations were consistent with significant quantities of silver ore. Not a vein, a deposit, broad and deep, the kind of thing that, when properly extracted, could produce returns of a scale that Silas did not have an easy frame of reference for. The surveyor put a number on it. A conservative estimate, he said 3 times, emphasizing the conservatism. And the number was so far beyond anything Silas had been operating with in his head that he had to ask him to say it again. He said it again. Silas sat with it. Evelyn, who was standing at the window because there weren't enough chairs, heard the number and was careful not to let her expression do too much. "How confident are you?" Silas asked. "In the formation, very confident. In the quantity, the estimate carries a margin of perhaps 20% in either direction." Garrett was precise about this. "But even at the lower end of that margin, Mr. Mercer, the number is significant." "Significant," Silas said, a little flatly. "Yes." Silas looked at the papers on the table. He looked at them for a long time. "Harrow has known this," he said, "or known something like it. Given what you've described of his interest in this property, I would consider that highly probable," Garrett said. He was careful not to say more than he could substantiate. Silas nodded. Then he stood up, which was clearly a dismissal in his body language, and Garrett gathered his papers and went. The study was quiet. "Say it," Silas said. He was looking out the window. "I'm not going to say I told you so," she said. "I know you're not. Say what you're actually thinking." She thought about it honestly. "I'm thinking that this changes the stakes considerably," she said, "and that Harrow is going to know, from the fact that you didn't contact him after the barn, that you're not folding, and that a man who burns down buildings when he's frustrated and still has the upper hand is not going to become more reasonable now that he's losing it." Silas turned around from the window. "That's what I'm thinking too," he said. "So we need to move faster than 6 weeks," she said. "Yes," he said, "we do." The meeting of the ranchers was set for Saturday. That was 3 days away. 3 days was long enough for several things to happen, and not all of them would be good. But it was what they had, and they were people who had learned, both of them in their different ways, to work with what was there. On the Friday before the meeting, when everything was still poised and uncertain, when Harrow had gone quiet in a way that was somehow louder than anything he'd said or done, Silas came into the kitchen in the early evening and stood in the doorway in a way that meant he had something to say. Evelyn looked up from the bread she was slicing. He said, "I know the timing isn't right. It's probably been not right for a while, and I've been using that as a reason to not say it." She set down the knife. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want to say that first, not as an apology, but just as a fact. I haven't had occasion to be for a long time." He was not looking away from her. Whatever this cost him, he was not looking away. "I know you came here for work. I know your life before this was a whole life that ended in a way that wasn't your choice. I'm not asking you to trade anything for anything." He paused. "I'm just asking if what this is, between us, is something I'm reading right, because I would rather know, even if I'm wrong, than keep not knowing." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn looked at him. "You're reading it right," she said. Something went out of his shoulders. Tension she hadn't entirely realized was there. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she picked the knife back up and finished slicing the bread, because supper wasn't going to make itself. And he sat down at the kitchen table, and the ordinary evening assembled itself around them the way it did. And underneath it, something had finally been said that had been waiting to be said for a long time. It was not a perfect moment. The barn was still ash and ruin outside the window. Harrow was still out there in the dark, planning something. The meeting with the ranchers was tomorrow, and nothing was guaranteed. But this was true, and it was here, and they were both choosing it. That was not nothing. That was in fact the whole of it. They came on a Saturday morning, arriving separately the way people do when they haven't yet decided how much they trust the gathering they've agreed to attend. Hadley came first, a broad, sunburned man in his 50s with the kind of permanent squint that comes from too many decades of reading weather on an open horizon. He tied his horse at the post and came to the door with his hat in his hands and the careful bearing of someone who has decided to be here but hasn't quite decided what to think yet. Evelyn let him in and gave him coffee, and he sat at the long kitchen table and looked at the table rather than around the room, which was how she knew he was worried. Mrs. Hatch arrived 20 minutes later in a small wagon she drove herself, moving with the efficiency of a woman who found being driven by other people a waste of time better spent thinking. She came through the door, accepted coffee, sat down, and immediately began an observation about the condition of the road from her property that she converted, without obvious transition, into a commentary on county maintenance as a measure of institutional competence. Hadley appeared to find this marginally calming, which said something about the value of someone willing to fill silence with certainty. The Coltons were last. They came together on horseback, and Evelyn watched them from the kitchen window as they tied their horses. Owen deliberate and unhurried, Ned with the clipped movements of a man who had already spent his patience somewhere before he arrived. They came inside without speaking to each other, which told her the ride over had contained a conversation that hadn't resolved. Silas came in from the yard where he'd been with Cal, and he stood at the head of the table and looked at the people assembled there. 5 of them, including Evelyn, who had taken the chair at the end without discussion or invitation, and nobody had said anything about it. "I appreciate all of you coming," he said. "I know some of you have reservations about being here. I'd rather you stayed with those reservations intact than felt I'd maneuvered you into anything. So I'm going to tell you exactly what I know, and then you can decide." He told them everything. He told it in the same methodical way he'd told Ferris, but with the geological assessment added now, and the surveyor's findings, and the barn, and the particular line in Harrow's last letter. He laid the Weston documents on the table and passed them around. He put the surveyor's preliminary report beside them. He described the cut fence posts, the riders on the ridge, the pattern that Ferris had identified across the properties Harrow had previously acquired. Nobody interrupted him. Even Ned Colton, who looked like a man constitutionally opposed to sitting quietly through anything, listened. When Silas finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Owen Colton spoke first. "The man who came to see me," he said. He was looking at the surveyor's report, not at Silas. "He knew about our note at the bank. He knew the amount and the term and the name of the man who holds it." "That's not public information," Silas said. "No," Owen said. "It's not." He was quiet for a moment, working something through. "He told me he could help with it. Said he had relationships with various lending institutions, and that a man in his position was often able to smooth arrangements that might otherwise become complicated." Owen looked up. "At the time I thought it was a generous offer. Now I think it was a threat wearing a generous offer's clothes." "That's exactly what it was," Mrs. Hatch said, without particular heat. "Just factually." Ned was looking at Silas. "The barn," he said. "Yes," Silas said. "You know it was him." "I know it was someone connected to him, proving it is what Ferris is working on." Ned's jaw moved. "The proving takes time, and the man keeps operating in the meanwhile." "Yes," Silas said again. "So what do you want from us?" Ned said. It wasn't hostile, or not entirely. It was the directness of a man who needed to know the actual ask before he could respond to it. Silas looked at him steadily. "I want you to document everything that's happened. Every contact Harrow or anyone connected to him has made with your properties. Every offer, every visit, every piece of information they shouldn't have had. I want you to give those accounts to Ferris. Together, what happened to each of us separately starts to look like what it is, a coordinated campaign." He paused. "And I want you to hold, not sell, not take the next meeting, not negotiate with anyone Harrow sends to your door." The table was quiet. Hadley said, "What if the banknote does become a problem for the Coltons?" "I've spoken to Ferris about that," Silas said. "If the lending arrangement becomes weaponized, if someone applies pressure on that note that wouldn't normally be applied, there are legal remedies. It's not common for those remedies to succeed fast enough to be comfortable, but they exist." He stopped, then said something that was clearly harder for him to say than everything that had come before. "And I have resources. If it comes to needing a bridge to protect the property while the legal work proceeds, I can discuss that." Owen looked at him sharply. Ned's expression shifted. "You're offering to back our note," Owen said. "I'm offering to discuss options," Silas said carefully. "I'm not in the business of making men feel obligated, but I'm also not going to pretend that I have advantages in this situation that you don't, and that pooling resources is less useful than each of us standing alone." The silence this time was different, heavier, more charged. The kind of silence that contains the specific discomfort of people being offered help they need and aren't sure they can accept with dignity. Mrs. Hatch broke it, which Evelyn suspected she did deliberately. "I've been in this valley for 41 years, the old woman said. She wasn't looking at anyone in particular. She was looking at the middle of the table, the way people do when they're talking to everyone. "My husband built our place. He died 15 years ago and left me with a property and a son who went to California and didn't come back, which was his right, and I've run it since." She picked up her coffee cup. "I'm not easily frightened, but I'll tell you what does frighten me. It's not Harrow. Not specifically. It's the idea that the valley gets picked apart piece by piece while everyone stands on their own property, wondering if they should have done something different. She set the cup down. Silas is offering you a coalition. That's a real thing. I'd take it seriously. Another silence. Then Owen Colton looked at his brother. Ned gave him a look that was almost imperceptible, the shorthand of brothers who've been reading each other for decades. Owen looked at Silas. We'll document what happened, he said, and we'll hold. A pause. The note situation, if it comes to that, we'll talk. That's all I'm asking, Silas said. The meeting lasted another 2 hours, working through the specifics. What documentation Ferris needed, what format, which incidents were most legally relevant, how the communication between them should be handled going forward. Mrs. Hatch was unexpectedly systematic about this, producing a small notebook from her coat pocket and writing things down in a hand so precise it looked printed. Evelyn fed them all at noon. Nothing elaborate. She'd been up since before dawn getting it together, soup and bread, and a dried apple cake that Danny had somehow helped with the previous evening without being asked, appearing in the kitchen at 8 o'clock and saying he knew how to peel apples if that was useful, which it was. The food had the effect that food generally does in difficult rooms. It gave people something neutral to do with their hands, it lowered the temperature slightly, it created the brief illusion of normalcy that people need sometimes just to keep going. Ned Colton ate 3 pieces of the apple cake and said, around the 3rd piece to no one in particular, "This is good." "Thank you," Evelyn said. He looked at her. The first time he'd looked at her directly all morning. Something in his expression shifted, some calibration happening. "You're not what the town says you are," he said. It was not exactly a compliment. It was more like a correction of a prior conclusion. "I know," she said. He nodded and went back to his cake, and that was the end of it, but it was something. Ferris received the accounts from Hadley and the Coltons and Mrs. Hatch within the week. He read them carefully, compared them to what Silas had already provided, and sent a letter to Silas that was uncharacteristically direct for a man who communicated primarily in qualifications. The pattern is now documented across 5 properties and spans approximately 26 months. The incidents include property damage, financial coercion through third-party lending arrangements, information obtained through means that require investigation, and written communication that constitutes implied threat. I am filing a formal complaint with the territorial court. I am also writing to the Federal Land Commissioner's office, as some of what I am seeing suggests potential violations of federal statutes regarding mineral rights fraud. This is no longer solely a local matter. Silas read the letter twice, then handed it to Evelyn. She read it, set it on the desk. "Federal," she said. "Ferris doesn't write to the federal commissioner unless he thinks it will hold," Silas said. He was standing by the window, the afternoon light coming in flat and cold. He's been doing this for 23 years. He doesn't reach that far unless the evidence justifies it. What does it mean for the timeline? It means it gets longer and shorter at the same time, he said. The legal proceeding gets longer, but Harrow's window for maneuvering gets shorter, because once federal involvement is formal, his options narrow considerably. Evelyn thought about this. "He'll know," she said. "Once Ferris files, Harrow will know. He has contacts everywhere. He's made sure of that. He'll know within days." "Yes, and a man who burned a barn when he thought he had time," she said, "is going to do something else when he realizes he doesn't." Silas looked at her. "Yes," he said again, quieter. "What can we do?" "Make sure there's nothing here that he can burn that's worse than the barn," he said. "The documents, the Weston letters, the surveyor's report, Ferris's correspondence, I'm having copies made. 1 set stays with Ferris, 1 set goes to a lockbox at the bank in Red Rock, which is far enough from here that it's out of Harrow's immediate reach." He paused. "And Cal and the men are on watch, proper watch, in shifts. We're not catching another fire by smell." "How are the men?" she asked. "About all of this." Silas considered it. "Cal is Cal. He doesn't rattle. Danny," he stopped, something moving across his face. "Danny came to me 2 days after the barn, said he wanted to know if there was anything he could do that would be more useful than what he was doing. Said he understood if I needed to let men go to cut costs." He looked at the window again. "He's 17 years old and he offered to work for reduced wages until things stabilized." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him his wages weren't changing and I'd fire him before I reduced them," Silas said. He seemed confused by that. He's not used to employers who work that way. No, Silas said. He's not. He straightened, turning from the window. The other men are solid. A couple of them have been with the ranch long enough that this feels personal to them, which it is. She nodded. The afternoon had gone from flat to dim while they'd been talking, the light shifting toward the gray of early evening. There's something I want to say, she said. Then say it. I've been thinking about the day I arrived here, she said. What I was carrying, what I was afraid of. She looked at him steadily. I was afraid of running out of options. That was the thing underneath everything else. The feeling that if this didn't work, I didn't have another step. And that fear makes you small. It makes you act small, think small, take less than you should because you're afraid that asking for more will cost you what little you have. He was listening, not rushing her. I'm not afraid that way anymore, she said. I want you to know that. Whatever happens with Harrow, however this goes, I'm not here because I don't have options. I have options. I'm here because I want to be here. She paused. I thought that was worth saying plainly. He looked at her for a moment with the particular look she had come to understand meant he was feeling something he hadn't organized into words yet. It is, he said, worth saying. All right, she said. He crossed the room. He stopped close to her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the particular solidity of a man who had been outdoor physical his whole life, something that was still slightly surprising up close. He raised one hand and touched her face, just briefly, his thumb at her jaw, nothing more. And then he dropped his hand and stepped back because they were both people who moved carefully, who had been hurt by moving too fast toward things they wanted, and caution was not the same as absence. Thank you, he said, for staying. Stop thanking me for it, she said. I'll stop being able to take it seriously. Something that was nearly a smile crossed his face. Fair enough, he said. Harrow's response to Ferris's filing was not another burned building. It was more sophisticated than that, and in some ways more frightening, because it was the move of a man who had decided that crude pressure had reached its limit, and it was time to operate in the territory where he was most comfortable, the law itself. Harrow's attorneys, 3 of them, brought in from the city, which told Silas something about the resources being deployed, filed a counter-complaint asserting that the geological survey had been conducted improperly, that the Weston documents were of questionable authenticity, and that Silas Mercer had made defamatory statements to third parties, meaning the neighboring ranchers, that had caused material damage to Harrow's business interests. The defamation claim was the most aggressive piece because it was designed to put Silas on the defensive, to make the conversation about what Silas had said rather than what Harrow had done. Ferris, when he read it, allowed himself a longer silence than usual. They're trying to flip the frame, Ferris said. He and Silas were in his office. The smell of tobacco and old paper as constant as always. Make you the aggressor. Make the coalition look like a conspiracy against a legitimate businessman. Can they make that stick? Silas asked. Not if the federal complaint is taken seriously, Ferris said, which is why they've also filed a motion to have the federal involvement reviewed, basically arguing that the matter is local and doesn't warrant federal jurisdiction. He set the papers down. They're building walls on every side. The goal is to make this so complicated and expensive that you exhaust your resources and your will before anything gets resolved. They don't know how much I have, Silas said. They may know more than you'd like, Ferris said carefully. Harrow has been effective partly because he gathers information. I'd assume he has a reasonable understanding of your financial position. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then let him understand it, he said. If his calculation is that I'll run out before he does, let's test that calculation. Ferris looked at him. That's not nothing, he said. That's genuinely not nothing, Silas. But I want to be honest with you. Legal proceedings of this complexity at this level can take years. Even when you're right. Even when the evidence is clear. I understand that. Do you? Because understanding it abstractly and living it are... My father built this ranch board by board in ground that most men thought was too rocky to bother with, Silas said. He held it through drought and bad prices and a winter in '79 that killed half his cattle. He didn't do it because it was easy or because he was sure he'd win. He did it because he'd decided it was his, and he was right about that. He paused. I can hold, Ferris. The lawyer looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, he said. Then let's give you something more to hold with. What Ferris had found, and had been waiting until he was certain before sharing, was a land transaction record from 8 years prior. A property 2 counties east, a ranching family named Severance, who had sold to a holding company that turned out, after 3 layers of corporate organization, to be connected to Victor Harrow. The severances had signed under circumstances that, as Ferris put it with his characteristic precision, bore a notable resemblance to what is occurring in Dry Hollow Valley. The wife of the elder Severance, a woman named Pearl, was still alive. She had been, Ferris said, amenable to speaking with him. How amenable? Silas asked. She used the phrase waited years for this when I explained the situation, Ferris said. I'd call that amenable. Pearl Severance arrived in Dry Hollow on a Wednesday, 14 days before the first court hearing, on the afternoon stage. She was a gray-haired woman with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have been carrying anger for a long time and have learned to carry it efficiently. She came to the ranch because Evelyn had extended the invitation. Ferris had suggested it would be easier than the lawyer's office, that a kitchen table was a better place for the kind of conversation this needed to be. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and told them what had happened to her family's land 8 years before, and she told it without drama because the facts themselves were dramatic enough without assistance. The pattern was identical. The initial approach, the polite offers, the increasing pressure, the sudden emergence of complications with their land title. Complications that turned out to have been manufactured, though proving that had taken 3 years they didn't have. A fire, in their case, that had taken the farmhouse rather than a barn. The final sale, under duress, at a fraction of what the land had yielded for Harrow's interest since. Evelyn listened to all of it. She watched Pearl Severance's face while the woman talked. Not the composed surface of it, which was steady and controlled, but the slight tightening around the eyes when she described the fire. The barely perceptible pause before she said her husband's name. Your husband, Evelyn said gently. Pearl was quiet for a moment. He died 2 years after the sale, she said. He was not an old man. He was 61 years old and he had farmed that land for 30 years and losing it. She stopped. He didn't recover from it. Not fully. Some people don't. The kitchen was very quiet. Silas, who had barely spoken, said, I'm sorry. Pearl looked at him. I didn't come here for sorrow, she said, not unkindly. I came because your lawyer told me you have a real chance of stopping this, and if I can help with that... She paused. Then Harold's land means something beyond just being gone. Evelyn reached across the table and covered the woman's hand briefly with hers. Pearl looked at it, then looked at Evelyn with the expression of someone accepting something they'd been too guarded to accept for a long time. I'll testify, Pearl said. Whatever you need. The first hearing was in the territorial courthouse in a town called Mill Haven, 40 miles east of Dry Hollow. It was not the final proceeding. Ferris had been careful to manage expectations about that. It was an early hearing on the competing motions. Harrow's attorneys seeking to dismiss the federal involvement and challenge the survey findings. Ferris seeking to establish the pattern of conduct across multiple properties as a unified course of action. They rode to Millhaven on a Wednesday morning, a larger party than Silas was accustomed to organizing. Himself and Evelyn, Ferris, Mrs. Hatch, who had insisted on attending and could not be reasonably persuaded otherwise, and Ned Colton, who had volunteered without being asked while Owen stayed to manage both properties. The courthouse was a solid stone building that conveyed, by its construction, the belief that law was something permanent enough to deserve permanence. Harrow was already inside when they arrived. Silas saw the man for only the second time across the corridor, and what struck him again was what he'd said to Evelyn months ago. Expensive. Everything about him communicated cost. His attorneys were 3 men with the polished, well-rested look of people who had never had to wonder if they could afford to keep going. Harrow looked at Silas across the corridor. He didn't look alarmed or threatened or any of the things Silas might have hoped to see. He looked, if anything, faintly curious, the way a man looks at a problem that has become more interesting than he expected. Then he looked at Evelyn, briefly, and something in his expression shifted in a way that Silas didn't like but couldn't specifically name. He looked away. They went inside. The hearing lasted 4 hours, which was longer than Ferris had estimated and included, at one point, a recess during which Harrow's lead attorney, a man named Colfax, silver-haired and smooth as Riverstone, said something to his colleague that Silas couldn't hear, but that produced a short, quiet laugh. In the corridor during the recess, Evelyn stood with Silas and said nothing, which was the correct thing. She was aware of how he was holding himself. Very still, very controlled, the way he was when he was managing something he couldn't afford to let show. They're not worried, he said. They're performing not being worried, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her. A man who is genuinely not worried doesn't laugh in a courthouse corridor where the other party can see him, she said. That's a show. It's meant to be seen. She kept her voice low. Ferris knows what he's doing. You can't know that. No, she agreed, but I know what it looks like when someone's improvising, and Ferris is not improvising. He came in there with something. I could see it in how he was sitting. Silas looked down the corridor at Ferris, who was reviewing papers with his associate, his pipe unlit in his coat pocket. Maybe, he said. Watch his hands, she said. He stops being still with his hands when he's got something. He was not still in there. Silas watched Ferris for a moment. Then, despite everything, something very small and nearly invisible crossed his face that was adjacent to amusement. You've been watching him for 2 hours, he said. I've been watching everyone for 2 hours, she said. It's what I do. He almost said something to that. Before he could, the bailiff called them back inside. What Ferris had, what he'd been holding, as it turned out, was a deposition from Pearl Severance, submitted into the record with the federal complaint, that established with documented specificity the identical pattern used against the Severance family 8 years prior. And beneath that, discovered through the Federal Land Commissioner's preliminary investigation, were records of 2 other properties in different counties, where land transfers connected to Harrow's holding entities had occurred under circumstances that the Commissioner's office had flagged as requiring review. Not 2 cases, 4 including Silas's once his was added. Colfax's objections were numerous and well-formed and professionally delivered, but the presiding judge, a compact woman in her 60s named Honorable Margaret Tate, who had the air of someone who had stopped being impressed by well-formed objections somewhere in the previous decade, overruled the motion to exclude federal jurisdiction. The pattern, she said, was sufficiently documented to warrant the wider review. It was not a victory. Ferris was clear about this on the ride back, specific in his refusal to let them treat it as more than it was. It means we continue, he said. It means the federal involvement is real, and Harrow can't make it disappear with emotion. It does not mean we've won anything. But Mrs. Hatch, who had sat in the back of the courtroom with her notebook, said as they rode, Colfax lost a step in there. Not much. But lawyers like that don't lose steps on things they expect to lose steps on. She said it to the road ahead of her, not to anyone in particular. He was surprised by Pearl Severance. They didn't know about her, Ned said. They knew about her, Mrs. Hatch said. They didn't know Ferris had a deposition. There's a difference. She folded her hands in her lap. Harrow didn't know about that deposition, which means there's something Harrow doesn't know. That's new. What Harrow did next came not against the ranch, but against Evelyn. It was subtle, which was almost worse. She noticed it first as an absence. The feed store in Dry Hollow that had been filling the ranch orders suddenly had delays, explained in apologetic but vague terms. The supplier who'd been providing the ranch's winter grain had received apparently a better offer from another buyer. Small things. Administrative friction. The kind of thing that individually looked like ordinary business difficulty and collectively looked like someone making phone calls. Then she heard about the letter. It was Mrs. Hatch who told her, appearing at the ranch on a Tuesday morning unannounced, which was unlike her enough to be immediately significant. I heard something, Mrs. Hatch said. She sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and was uncharacteristically indirect for approximately 45 seconds, which was the longest Evelyn had seen the woman be indirect. There's a letter circulating, in town, among certain parties. It's written as though it's from someone in Abilene, where you lived before. Evelyn was still. It suggests, Mrs. Hatch said carefully, that your husband's death was not entirely straightforward, that there were financial irregularities surrounding it, that your departure from Abilene was less voluntary than you've implied. Evelyn set down her cup. None of that is true, she said. I know it's not true, Mrs. Hatch said, without missing a beat. I've known enough liars in my life to know the particular flavor of one operating at a distance. She looked at Evelyn directly. But it's circulating, and in a small town, circulation is its own kind of damage. Evelyn sat with this for a moment. She was aware of several things simultaneously. The anger, which was clean and cold and entirely justified. The older, more familiar fear, which was the fear of being unmade by a story that had nothing to do with who she actually was. And underneath both of those, something steadier, something that had been growing in her for months without her fully acknowledging it. Does Silas know? She asked. I came to you first, Mrs. Hatch said. All right. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. I'll tell him. Yes, Mrs. Hatch said. You should. She told him that evening. She told it plainly, the same way she'd told him about Thomas. Just the facts, in order, without asking for anything specific in return. She watched his face while she talked, and she saw, very clearly, the moment when the anger settled into the particular stillness that she'd come to understand was not calm, but was the surface of something much colder. He's going after you because he can't get to me directly, Silas said. Yes. And he knows that attacking you... He stopped. He looked at the table, then at her. He's had eyes on this ranch for months. He knows that you... He stopped again. That we matter to each other, she said. Yes. I know, she said. I thought of that too. He was quiet for a long moment. She let him be quiet. Then he said, I want to do something right now that would be satisfying and counterproductive. Don't, she said. I'm not going to. Good. But, Evelyn... He looked at her with something she didn't often see from him, something raw enough that she thought he might not know it was visible. This is my fault. You came here for work, and what you got was a man with an enemy who's now using you to get to him. Stop that, she said. Not gently. He blinked. I'm not a bystander in this, she said. I'm not a hostage you took. I'm here because I chose to be, and what Harrow does with that choice is Harrow's fault, not yours. She held his gaze. Do not manage me by taking responsibility for things that aren't yours to take. He was quiet. Then he said with something that was almost sheepish, You're right. I know, she said. What are we going to do about the letter? He thought about it. Ferris, he said. If it can be traced, and fabricated letters from a town 300 miles away have origins that can sometimes be traced, it becomes evidence. If it can't be traced, we document it and move on, and let people decide for themselves what it means. Some people will believe it, she said. Some people believed it before there was a letter, he said quietly. That's not new. She looked at him. He was right, and she knew it, and it still sat in her chest like something with edges. All right, she said. I'm sorry, he said, meaning it, not as a performance of responsibility, but as the real thing, the acknowledgement between two people that something unfair has happened, and the only honest response is to name it. I know, she said. They sat with it, the way they'd learned to sit with the things that couldn't be fixed immediately. Not turning away from them, not making them smaller than they were, just sitting with them until the sitting itself became a way of getting through. Ferris could not trace the letter definitively, but what his associate found was enough. A stationery supplier in Mill Haven who had recently fulfilled an unusual order for paper printed with an Abilene Postal District header. The order had come through an intermediary. The intermediary was connected to a name that appeared twice in other documents related to Harrow's operations. And the whole chain was thin enough that it would not have been enough alone. But it was not alone. It was part of a file that was getting thicker. Ferris added it to the federal complaint with a brief covering note that described it as consistent with a pattern of intimidation extending beyond property matters to the personal and reputational harassment of individuals connected to the primary complainant. The language was dry and legal. What it meant was, they are attacking her because of him, and we have the paper trail. The court date, the real one, the full hearing, was set for 6 weeks out. Mill Haven, again, before Judge Tate. 6 weeks. Silas stood on the porch on the evening after Ferris sent word, and Evelyn stood beside him, and the valley spread out below them in the early dark. The land, the ridge, the east pasture where the survey team had done their work, the place where the barn had stood and now stood in early reconstruction because Cal had started it 2 weeks ago, and it seemed important not to let it stay ash. 6 weeks, Silas said. It's not so long, she said. It feels long. Most necessary things do, she said. He looked at her sideways, and she looked back, and neither of them smiled because it wasn't the kind of moment that called for smiling. Whatever happens in that courtroom, he said. I know, she said. I haven't said it. I know what you haven't said, she told him. You don't have to say it in a particular order. He was quiet for a moment, and then, because Silas Mercer was a man who had decided that not saying things clearly had cost him enough across the years, he said it. I love you, he said. Flat and honest, the way he said everything that mattered. I don't know what the timing is on that, or whether it's what you want to hear right now, but I've been carrying it for a while, and I thought it might be better out than in. She looked at him. The barn reconstruction was a skeleton of new beams in the dark. The valley was quiet. Somewhere in the distance, one of the horses made a sound and was quiet again. "It's what I want to hear," she said. He exhaled, which told her how much he'd been holding. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They stood there on the porch in the cold, and it was not a comfortable cold, and none of it was resolved, and the court date was still 6 weeks away, and Harrow was still out there in his expensive suit with his 3 attorneys and his burning patience. But this was true. And it was here. And they were in it together, which had become, without either of them quite marking the day it happened, the only way either of them wanted to be in anything. The night came down over Dry Hollow Valley. The new barn framing stood against the sky. They went inside. The 6 weeks did not pass quietly. Harrow made 2 more attempts to settle before the hearing, both through Colfax, both framed as reasonable compromise, both constructed in a way that would have required Silas to relinquish the mineral rights while retaining nominal ownership of the surface land. Ferris read both offers in the methodical way he read everything and then described them, with characteristic precision, as the legal equivalent of a man offering to return your house after he's removed the foundation. Silas declined both without extended deliberation. What the 6 weeks did produce was a particular kind of waiting that wore on people in different ways. Cal, who had managed difficulty by staying in motion, worked himself and the men harder than usual rebuilding the barn. The frame was up by the 3rd week, the walls by the 5th, and watching it rise board by board out of the ash and ruin of the old one had an effect on everyone at the ranch that nobody discussed directly, but that was visible in how people carried themselves. Danny, who had been 17 when this started and seemed in some ways to have aged past that, spent his spare hours learning to read from Evelyn, who had offered without making a project of it, simply leaving one of Thomas's simpler books open on the kitchen table one evening and saying she could help with the parts that were harder if he was interested. He was interested. He sat at the kitchen table 3 evenings a week, with the concentration of someone who understands that what they're learning is not just letters. Owen Colton held. It cost him something. She could see it in his face on the 2 occasions he came to the ranch in those weeks. The look of a man who is not naturally brave and has decided to be brave anyway, which is, in some ways, harder than the natural kind. He never said anything about it. He came, he sat at the table, he drank coffee, he reported that everything was quiet on his property and Harrow's people had stopped coming around, which Ferris had explained was itself a legal calculation. Any further contact with the neighboring ranchers could be construed as ongoing harassment and added to the federal complaint. Ned Colton, characteristically, seemed less burdened by the waiting than his brother. He appeared one Saturday morning unannounced with 2 of his men and spent most of the day helping with the barn construction, working without being asked and leaving without much ceremony. And Silas thanked him on his way out, and Ned said, "Don't thank me yet," and rode home, which was about as close to solidarity as Ned Colton got. Mrs. Hatch came twice. The second time, she brought a jar of preserved plums from her cellar, set it on the kitchen table, and said to Evelyn, "You're holding up well." It was the highest form of compliment the old woman apparently had available, and Evelyn received it as such. The night before the hearing, Silas did not sleep. Evelyn knew because she didn't sleep either. Not well, anyway. Not the deep under kind of sleep that actually rests you. She lay awake in the small room that had been hers since the first week, and listened to the quiet of the house and thought about the way this story had assembled itself around her without her planning any of it. She had come here for work. She had come for $14 a month, and a room that was small but warm, and a floor beneath her feet when she'd run out of floor. She had come with Thomas's books on her dresser and the specific weight of a grief she was still learning to carry without letting it become the whole of her. And somehow, in the business of peeling potatoes and banking fires and putting out 2 cups instead of 1, she had built something she hadn't known she was building, not a replacement for what she'd lost. She had stopped believing that was how it worked, that you replaced things. You just eventually found that your hands were doing something new, and the something new was real, and it coexisted with what was gone. The same way morning coexisted with the night that came before it, neither erasing the other. She thought about Thomas, who had remembered things she said 2 months later and asked about them. She thought about his books, 3 of which were still on the dresser, their spines cracked from his reading. She thought about how grief was not a thing you finished, but a thing you learned to carry differently over time. The way you adjust your grip on something heavy for the long walk rather than trying to put it down. And she thought about Silas, awake somewhere in the house, doing his own version of whatever she was doing. She got up and put her robe on and went to the kitchen and made coffee, because it was 4 in the morning and there was nothing useful to do with sleeplessness except caffeinate it. He came into the kitchen 15 minutes later, which she'd expected. He sat down. She set a cup in front of him. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she said. He looked at the cup. "I keep thinking about what Colfax is going to do in there tomorrow." "He's going to try to make the case about you," she said. "About your motives, your intelligence, your character. He's going to try to make the jury, or whoever's listening, look at you and see an obstinate man protecting something out of stubbornness rather than right. You've been thinking about it too." "Yes." "And?" She sat down across from him. "And I think you need to let them look," she said. "Don't hide from it. Don't defend against it. Just let them look at you and say what you need to say and trust that what's true is visible if you're not busy trying to manage how you appear." He was quiet, turning the cup slowly. She'd watched him do that for months. Turn cups, turn his hat, turn things in his hands while his mind worked. "I'm not good at courtrooms," he said. "I know. You're good at being honest, and that's more useful." "They're better at this than I am. Colfax has done this 100 times. "He's done what he does 100 times, she said. "He hasn't done you 100 times, and you have something he doesn't." "What's that?" "The truth," she said. And then, before he could give her the look that deserved, "I know how that sounds, but I mean it practically, not like a sentiment. You have documentation, you have Pearl Severance, you have 4 ranchers who will speak to the pattern, you have a surveyor's report, and you have Ferris, who is not a theatrical man, which means when he speaks it sounds like fact rather than argument." She held his gaze. "The truth, practically assembled, is what you have. That's not nothing." He looked at her across the table in the pre-dawn kitchen, the lamp between them throwing its small circle of light, and she thought he was going to say something about the case, or the hearing, or Colfax. Instead, he said, "I don't know how I would have done this without you." She was quiet for a moment. "You would have done it," she said. "You would have been angrier and more alone doing it, but you would have held." "Maybe," he said. "But this—" He gestured, a rare thing for him, a small motion that seemed to mean the kitchen, the table, the 2 cups, all of it. "This is better." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It is." The courtroom in Mill Haven was full, in a way that courtrooms are full when the matter before them has leaked into the general consciousness of a region. There were people in the gallery that Silas knew and people he didn't, and among the ones he knew were faces from Dry Hollow that he hadn't expected, the saddle-maker Whitfield, and 2 men from the feed store, and the woman from Garrett's general store who had once smiled cautiously at Evelyn across a counter. People who had formed their opinions of the situation in one direction and had come, apparently, to see which way it was going to settle. Evelyn sat in the gallery with Mrs. Hatch and Ned Colton and Pearl Severance, who had come back for the full hearing at Ferris's request and sat with the upright stillness of a woman who has waited a long time to be in this room. Silas sat at Ferris's table and did not look at the gallery, because looking at the gallery was the thing you did when you needed reassurance, and needing reassurance was something he couldn't afford at this particular moment. Colfax opened for Harrow's side with the professional ease of a man who had done this enough times that the performance was indistinguishable from naturalness. He characterized Silas as a man acting from emotion rather than reason, a rancher who had built a personal narrative around a business dispute, and then spread that narrative. He used the word defamatory 3 times in the first 10 minutes, to neighboring property owners, causing material damage to his client's legitimate business interests. He questioned the Geological Survey's methodology and technical language designed less to illuminate than to obscure. He referred to the Weston documents as historical speculation rather than evidence. He was very good. Evelyn watched him and recognized the specific skill of someone who understood that in a room where most people don't know the facts, what you're really arguing is which version of events feels more credible, and credibility was a performance he'd been polishing for 30 years. Ferris did not perform. That was the difference, and it was visible. Ferris presented. He laid things in front of the court the way you lay tools out before a job, deliberately, in order, each one connected to the next. Pearl Severance's account corroborated by the land transaction records, the 2 additional properties flagged by the federal commissioner's office, the documented intimidation across Silas's own property, the cut fences, the fire, the letter constructed to damage Evelyn's reputation, with the stationary trail attached. The surveyor's report, which he had anticipated Colfax challenging and had therefore prepared with the surveyor himself present as a witness. A compact and meticulous man who was constitutionally incapable of saying anything he couldn't substantiate. It took most of the morning. Judge Tate asked questions. They were not the questions of a person being convinced. They were the questions of a person who was already thinking ahead, who was testing the structure of the argument for load-bearing weaknesses. She asked Colfax twice to clarify things he had left deliberately vague, and both times the clarification was less helpful to his case than the vagueness had been. Then she called Silas. He sat in the witness chair and looked at the room and did what Evelyn had told him to do. He let them look. Colfax cross-examined him for 45 minutes, and it was the kind of examination designed to make a person feel stupid, dense with legal language, circular in structure, doubling back to catch inconsistencies, questioning Silas's understanding of geological assessments he'd admitted he wasn't trained to read, questioning his motives for speaking to the neighboring ranchers, returning several times to a version of the question. Isn't it possible that you've simply misunderstood a straightforward business negotiation? Silas answered each question directly and without elaboration. He did not get defensive, which was hard. He did not fill silences with extra words, which was harder. When Colfax asked him to characterize his relationship with Evelyn Reed and implied, without quite saying, that her involvement in reviewing his father's documents and coordinating the rancher coalition indicated a motive beyond employment, Silas looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "She's the most clear-headed person I've encountered in this situation, or most others. I'd have been glad of her judgment, regardless of anything else between us. Those are two separate things, and I think you're aware they're separate." Colfax moved on. But something in the room had shifted slightly, in the way rooms shift when someone says a thing plainly that has been circling the space indirectly. When Ferris stood for redirect, he asked Silas one question. "Mr. Mercer, in your own words, why have you refused to sell this land?" Silas looked at the room, not at Evelyn specifically, though he was aware of her in the gallery. He looked at the general fact of the room, all these people who had come to see what kind of man he was. "My father built that ranch," he said. "He built it in ground that wasn't easy, and he held it through things that weren't easy, and he left it to me because he trusted I'd do the same. That's one reason." He paused. "The other reason is that a man who will burn your barn and manufacture lies about people you care about and call it business negotiation, what he's really asking you to accept is that dignity has a price, that if he applies enough pressure to enough things you value, you'll decide that your own sense of what's right is negotiable." He stopped. "I'm not interested in being that kind of man. That's the other reason." The courtroom was quiet in the way it is when something has been said that doesn't have an immediate response. Judge Tate was writing something. She wrote for a long moment, unhurried. The ruling came 2 days later. Ferris delivered it to the ranch himself, which told Silas something before he'd opened the door all the way, because Ferris was not a man who delivered things in person unless they warranted it. He came in, sat at the kitchen table, accepted coffee that Evelyn poured, and opened his case. The court had ruled in Silas's favor on the primary complaint. The federal commissioner's involvement was upheld. The defamation counterclaim was dismissed. More significantly, the court had referred the matter of the fabricated letter and the coordinated pressure campaign across multiple properties to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for criminal review. That last piece was the one Ferris set down with particular care. "That's not the civil proceeding," he said. "That's separate. The criminal referral means the prosecutor decides whether to pursue charges. I don't want to overstate what that means at this stage." "What does it mean at this stage?" Silas asked. "It means that Victor Harrow's attorneys are, as of this morning, advising him that the situation has become considerably more complicated than he anticipated," Ferris said. He was as close to direct satisfaction as Evelyn had ever seen him. "It means that the other properties, the ones the federal commissioner's office flagged, those families now have standing to pursue their own actions. It means the structure he's built, which depended on each person believing they were isolated and acting alone, has been shown to be what it actually is." He paused. "And it means that his strategy of acquiring this specific land, given what the survey has now formally documented, is finished. The mineral rights are on record. Any future claim he attempts will be made in the full light of what's already in the federal record." Silas sat at the table for a moment. Evelyn watched him. She watched the way the information settled into him. Not with elation, not with the relief she might have expected. something quieter and more complicated. The expression of a man who has been holding against something for so long that when the thing finally gives way, the first feeling is not triumph, but something closer to exhaustion, and underneath the exhaustion, something more fragile than he would have liked anyone to see. The Coltons, he said, Hadley, Mrs. Hatch. All of them stand to benefit from the precedent set today, Ferris said. The pressure on Owen Colton's note, I'm fairly confident that particular arrangement is going to quietly resolve itself in the next few weeks. Men who rely on intimidation recalibrate quickly when intimidation stops working. Silas nodded. What about Pearl Severance? Evelyn said. Ferris looked at her. Her family's original land is now in the hands of a holding company that is going to be significantly occupied with federal scrutiny for the foreseeable future. He paused. I can't recover her land. The sale was legal even if the circumstances were not, and those are different problems. But I intend to pursue every avenue. He looked at his coffee. She deserves that, at minimum. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Silas said, Thank you, Edmund. Ferris looked mildly startled. In 23 years of practice, it was possible no one had used his first name while thanking him. He gathered his case, stood, and said, Don't thank me. Win decisively enough that your case protects someone else next time. That's the actual value of what happened today. He let himself out. Victor Harrow left the territory before winter. Not quietly. A man with his interests didn't disappear quietly. But there was a quality to his departure that was the opposite of his arrival. He had come in like a calculation, precise and confident. He left in pieces. The holding companies beginning the slow process of federal audit, 2 of his 3 attorneys withdrawing from further involvement, Colfax suddenly unavailable for comment on anything related to Dry Hollow Valley. The criminal referral moved slowly, as these things do. Ferris was honest about that. It would take time, possibly years, and the outcome was not guaranteed. But the referral itself meant that Harrow would spend a portion of his considerable resources on legal defense rather than expansion, and the properties he had acquired through the same methods were now the subject of formal investigation, which made every transaction he'd conducted in 3 counties suddenly and inconveniently visible. He had built an empire on the assumption that each person was alone. The moment that assumption failed, the empire started leaking from every seam. Evelyn learned this in increments, the way most resolutions actually arrive. Not as a single moment, but as a series of smaller moments that add up to something definitive. Owen Colton's banknote resolved itself as Ferris had predicted. A letter came from a family in the eastern counties who had heard, through channels she didn't entirely follow, what had happened in Millhaven and wanted to know if Ferris would take their case. Pearl Severance wrote to Evelyn, a proper letter, in a careful hand, that said, among other things, I sat in that courtroom and watched someone fight the way Harold fought, and I want you to know what that is worth to a person who thought they were watching alone. Evelyn read it twice, folded it, and put it in the back of Thomas's dictionary, beside the note she'd never unfolded again. Different things in the same place. That was how life actually worked, she thought. Not the old making room for the new, but both of them present at once, making you more layered than you were before, if you let them. It was Cal who started calling the rebuilt barn the new barn, and thereby settled the question of what it would be called, because Cal did not name things carelessly, and once he named something, it stayed named. The new barn was, structurally, better than what had burned. Danny had strong opinions about the framing that turned out to be correct, and Silas had let him act on them, which produced a building that was going to stand longer than its predecessor. It smelled of new wood and hay, and the particular animal warmth of horses, which was the smell the place was supposed to have, and it was enough. The town of Dry Hollow recalibrated the way small towns do after a public reckoning, gradually, without acknowledgement, in the direction of its own interests. The people who had been the loudest about Evelyn's motives went quiet on the subject, which was not an apology but was, in its way, a concession. Mrs. Fenner, the dry goods merchant's wife, nodded to Evelyn on the street one morning with the particular nod that means we are not going to discuss this, and Evelyn returned it in exactly the same spirit, because some reconciliations are done entirely in nods and that is fine. The saddlemaker Whitfield, who had come to the hearing and apparently left with a changed understanding of the situation, brought a set of reins to the ranch that he said he'd had sitting finished for a while and that matched Silas's best saddle, and he handed them over without making a speech about it, and Silas accepted them the same way. And that was the end of that particular estrangement. Small things. The large things had been decided. The small things were what came after, the reassembly of ordinary life around a different shape. There's a thing that happens to people who have fought hard for something and won, or come as close to winning as reality allows, which is never entirely clean. You expect to feel different. You've been running on the particular fuel of threatened things for so long that when the threat recedes, there's a moment of disorientation, like a body that's been braced against wind, and suddenly the wind has stopped. You're still braced. You don't know how not to be for a while. Silas moved through December in this way, doing the work that needed doing, managing the ranch, the cattle, the accounts, the rebuilt barn, the conversations with Ferris about the ongoing federal proceedings. He was not unhappy. He was, Evelyn thought, learning how to be undefended, which is a different skill from being defended, and one that didn't come naturally to a man who had spent 8 years building himself into something that could withstand things. She was patient with it. She understood it from the inside. She was doing her own version, learning how to stop waiting for the next thing to go wrong, how to stop assessing exits, how to let herself be somewhere without holding part of herself back in case she needed to leave in a hurry. That part was harder than she'd expected. Survival habits are sticky. They serve you when you need them and persist when you don't. And the work of letting them go is not dramatic. It's just a lot of ordinary mornings where you notice you've been holding your breath and decide to stop. She stopped more often as December went on. She started writing again. She had kept a journal since she was 16 and had stopped the day Thomas died. And picking it up again felt strange in the specific way that returning to something that once held you feels strange when you've changed enough that you're not sure it will hold you the same way. But it did, mostly, different, enough. Danny finished the book she'd started him on and asked about the next one, and she gave him one of Thomas's books, not the one she was keeping, but one she'd had duplicated in her mind so thoroughly that the physical copy felt shareable. He read it slowly and carefully, the way you read something when reading itself is still new, and came back with a question about a passage that was genuinely interesting, the kind of question that told her he was not just decoding, but thinking. She told him it was a good question. He looked at the table, the way young people do when they're pleased and don't know what to do with it. Thomas would have liked you, she said, which surprised her as she said it. Not because it was untrue, but because it was the first time she'd said Thomas's name in a forward-looking sentence, a sentence about what he would think rather than what he had thought. That was different. That meant something. Danny looked up, not sure what to do with that. He sounds like he was good, Danny said. He was, she said. He'd have asked you the same question. Silas asked her to marry him on a January morning, which was not a romantic month in Dry Hollow Valley, but was the month that happened to be when he was ready, and he was not a man who waited for the calendar to cooperate with his intentions. He asked her in the kitchen, which was where most of their important conversations had happened, and which was therefore appropriate, even if it was not the setting of a sentimental story. She was making biscuits. He came in from outside with cold still on his coat and stood at the counter and said without preamble, "I'd like you to marry me, if that's something you want." She went still for a moment, then she said, "You could have asked that with some more ceremony." "I know," he said. "Do you want ceremony or do you want an answer?" She looked at him, the particular worn into honesty face of him, the hands that still showed the faint marks of the fire, the way he stood like someone who had decided something and was prepared to be told it was wrong without taking it back. "Yes," she said, "that's my answer." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, which he had not done before. And it was not a perfect moment because her hands were floury and his coat smelled of horses, and outside the wind was doing something aggressive to the eaves, but it was entirely real, which was better. They were married in March, on the ranch, with the new barn visible through the windows and the valley coming out of winter in the grudging way it did. Not beautiful yet, but alive again, the first green showing in the low pastures. Ferris came. Mrs. Hatch came in her good dress and sat in the front row and cried exactly once, and then stopped, and was unsentimental for the remainder of the afternoon, which was, Evelyn thought, the most purely Mrs. Hatch thing she had ever witnessed. The Coltons came, both of them, Owen with his wife, Ned without, eating most of the food with cheerful efficiency. Hadley came and brought his daughter, who had never met Evelyn, and spent the afternoon watching her with the particular attention of a young woman trying to understand someone she finds interesting. Danny wore a shirt with a collar and was clearly uncomfortable in it and stayed in the collar anyway, which told you everything you needed to know about his character at 17. Cal stood at the back of the room through the ceremony and was the first one to shake Silas's hand afterward, which he did without words, holding on for a moment longer than a handshake required, And Silas understood what that meant and didn't need it said. Pearl Severance sent a letter. It arrived 2 days later. It said, "I heard the news through Ferris. You deserve this. Both of you. I mean that the way it is meant." Evelyn put it in Thomas's dictionary with the others. 3 letters in the back of an old book. An accounting of the things that had happened to her. All of them true. All of them present at once. There is a version of this story that ends with the mineral survey and the courtroom and the legal victory, and that version is not wrong exactly, but it's incomplete. Because what the story is actually about is something that doesn't appear in court records or geological reports. It's about the way that isolation the long practiced kind, the kind that becomes a whole way of living, can be so total that the person inside it has stopped recognizing it as a choice. Silas Mercer had built walls the way his father had built fences, methodically, for practical reasons, in response to real things that had happened. Clara's death. 8 years of managing grief by managing everything else. The discovery, repeated enough times to become a belief, that money was a kind of test that most people failed, and that the safest response to that was to stop offering the test. He had not been wrong about any of it. That was what made it so difficult to argue with. The lesson, if there is one, and Evelyn was suspicious of lessons that came out too clean, is not that love conquers loneliness, which is a romantic way of saying nothing. The lesson is closer to this, that the walls we build against pain have the same effect on joy, and the work of living is not to stop building walls but to remember, periodically, to check which direction the door swings. Evelyn had done her own version of this. She had survived on survival for a while. She had learned to be excellent at the practical things because the practical things were what was in front of her, and she had quietly, without quite deciding to, moved further and further from the person who had kept a journal since she was 16, and cried at Thomas's books and believed in her better moments that she was allowed to want a full life. What happened in Dry Hollow Valley was not that either of them became different people. People do not become different people. What happened was that both of them, slowly and without announcement, became more fully themselves, in the presence of someone who wasn't going to use it against them. That is not a small thing. It might be the whole thing. The valley in summer was green and wide, and the ridge to the east stood as it always had, the mineral deposits and its rock undisturbed for now. The subject of ongoing legal and logistical consideration that Silas approached with the same measured deliberateness he applied to everything. He was not in a hurry. He would do what was right with the land the way his father had done what was right with the land, carefully, without waste, in a way that left it better than he found it. The ranch ran. The cattle were managed. Cal was teaching Danny things that couldn't be taught from books, and Danny was absorbing them the way he absorbed everything now, with attention, with the awareness that knowing things was something he'd been given access to and intended to use. Some evenings, Evelyn still sat with Thomas's books. Not to mourn, or not only to mourn, but because the books were good, and Thomas had loved them, and she was someone who had loved a person who had loved these books, and that was a fact of her history that she carried with her the way you carry something you wouldn't put down even if you could. Silas knew about the books. He had asked about them once, genuinely curious, and she had told him, and he had listened the way he listened to things that mattered. He didn't ask her to stop. She didn't stop. That was how it was. Some mornings she woke early and the light was coming in the window at the angle that meant summer, long and warm, and she could hear the horses in the paddock and Cal's voice across the yard in the particular low tone he used when he was explaining something. And she lay there for a moment in the warm quiet and thought, this is my life now. Not the life she had planned, not the life she would have written if she'd been doing the writing. Just the life that had assembled itself from the available material, loss and survival and luck and stubbornness, and a walk of 3 miles in worn-down boots to knock on a stranger's gate. It was on balance more than she'd expected. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. The East Ridge stood unchanged through all of it, through winter and summer and everything that passed between. The land did not care about the things that happened on it. It was just land, the same as it had always been, holding what it held. But the people on it, the ones who had chosen to stay, who had chosen each other, who had decided together that belonging was worth the cost of fighting for, they carried it differently now. Not lighter, just differently. That is the most honest version of a good ending, not the weight gone, but the hand steadier, and someone beside you who knows how heavy it is.